I'm the crab, get me out! Copy, stand by, we're coming! Hurry, it's good weather!
The desert sun hammered down on the tarmac at Nellis Air Force Base like something that had forgotten the difference between punishment and weather. It was the kind of heat that did not sit on the surface of things it pressed through, found the concrete and the steel, and the human being standing on both, and settled into all of them with the patient confidence of something that had been here long before any of this was built and intended to remain long after. The mountains to the west were gray and still and offered no opinion on what was happening at their feet. The sky above them was the particular blue of high desert at altitude, clean, absolute, the kind of blue that looks painted rather than natural. It was 1447 on a Tuesday afternoon in September when the world stopped making sense. Lieutenant Riley Ashford's FA-18 Super Hornet appeared on the approach from the northwest, and from the moment it crossed the outer marker, it was wrong. The approach angle was too steep. The airspeed was 30 knots above where it should have been at this point in the sequence. The left engine was trailing a ribbon of black smoke that thickened as the aircraft descended, painting a dark diagonal across the clean sky in the way that things going wrong announced themselves gradually at first, then with increasing specificity, then all at once. The landing gear deployed late. The sound the hydraulic system made when it finally complied was audible from the flight line, a metallic protest that carried across the tarmac with the distinctive character of machinery being asked to perform beyond what it had been designed to perform. Everyone who heard it felt it in a different place. The experienced ones felt it in their chest. The newer personnel felt it and looked at the experienced ones to understand what they were feeling. What they saw on the experienced faces told them everything. On the ground, the crash crews were already moving before the aircraft crossed the runway threshold. Red lights spinning on the fire trucks. Sirens cutting through the afternoon in the flat, urgent way that sirens in open desert carry. Men running to positions they had drilled 1,000 times, positions they had rehearsed in daylight, in darkness, in heat and cold, positions that their feet found now without instruction from their thinking minds, because the thinking minds were occupied with hoping this would be one of the times they reached their positions, and nothing happened. Chief Danny Walsh, 15 years on crash rescue at Nellis, was in the cab of Truck 3 before the aircraft touched down. His hands moved through the pre-engagement sequence the way hands move through sequences. They have performed so many times that the sequence has become part of the body rather than a procedure stored in the memory. He had been in this cab on 3 previous occasions when the sequence had mattered in the way it was about to matter now. He remembered each of those occasions with a specificity that did not diminish with time. He suspected he was about to add a fourth. The Super Hornet hit the runway. The sound of it was something that a person who had never heard it could not adequately imagine from description alone. It was metal meeting concrete at high speed, under conditions that metal and concrete were not designed to meet under, and it expressed this incompatibility in a register that was less a sound than a physical event felt in the sternum, in the jaw, and somewhere behind the eyes before it arrived at the ears in any recognizable form. Sparks erupted from the undercarriage in a cascade that stretched 40 feet behind the aircraft as it made first contact and continued as the left landing gear, compromised by the same hydraulic failure that had delayed its deployment, collapsed inward on the second bounce with a sound like a gunshot amplified to architectural scale. The aircraft yawed hard left, the right wingtip dropping toward the concrete, and then the skid began violent, rotating the aircraft, spinning on its collapsed gear in a motion that carved a gouge into the runway surface deep enough that the repair crew would spend 3 days addressing it. The Super Hornet came to rest pointed 40 degrees off the runway, centerline the left side of the aircraft lower than the right, smoke already thickening from the engine cowling into something denser and more purposeful than the trail it had been leaving on approach. Then the fire came. It came from the left engine, first orange and immediate, and within seconds it had found the fuel that was available to it and had begun the process of becoming something larger. The crash crews closed in. Foam arced from the trucks and long white curtains. Men moved with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that each second was a unit of measurement in a calculation that only ran one direction. The front canopy blew. Lieutenant Commander Blake Ross, the pilot in the forward seat, ejected with the economy of motion that emergency training installs in people who have rehearsed it enough times that the body executes it before the conscious mind has fully engaged with the necessity. His seat rocketed upward and away from the burning aircraft. The parachute deployed with a crack that echoed flat across the tarmac. He came down 50 yards from the wreck, absorbed the landing with a roll that his knees registered, and his expression did not, and was on his feet and moving before the chute had fully settled. The rear canopy did not blow. Walsh saw this from Truck 3 as he brought the vehicle to its position on the left side of the aircraft. He saw the front seat empty, the parachute descending, and he saw the rear cockpit sealed, the canopy intact, and through the smoke-darkened transparency of it, he saw movement. She was alive, 28 years old, trapped. The ejection seat mechanism had not fired. The same hydraulic compromise that had cascaded through the aircraft's systems during the approach had reached the ejection sequence and had expressed its failure there as a jam, a specific mechanical refusal at the worst possible moment. Riley Ashford was working the manual release with both hands, her flight-gloved fingers moving through the procedure with the focused precision of someone who had memorized it and was executing it now against a timeline she could feel narrowing around her. She was not screaming. Walsh registered this with the particular attention that experienced emergency responders give to details that tell them something essential about the person they are working to save. She was not panicking. She was working. The distinction mattered in ways that were both practical and profound. He grabbed the external release handle on the left side of the cockpit frame. Two more men joined him, their heat-resistant suits already beginning to smoke at the seams from the intensity of the fire building beneath the aircraft. The fuel situation was deteriorating. Walsh could feel it in the temperature of the air against the exposed skin of his face, the specific rising heat of a fire that has found its supply and is growing toward what it intends to become. 30 seconds, he thought, maybe less. He pulled on the release handle. The canopy began to move, not fully, not cleanly, the heat warping the frame in ways that were working against the mechanism. He pulled harder, felt the resistance, felt the men beside him adding their weight to the problem. 20 seconds. Through the smoke-darkened canopy, he could see her eyes. Clear, working, not asking to be saved so much as working alongside the people trying to save her. Two efforts, hers from the inside, theirs from the outside, converging on the same mechanism from opposite directions. 10 seconds, the canopy lifted, an inch, 2 inches. Walsh felt the resistance change as the seal broke and the heat differential equalized, and the mechanism found the movement it had been refusing. Then the world came apart. The starboard fuel tank, its integrity already compromised by the impact, and the fire working along the aircraft's underside reached the threshold that fuel tanks reach when they have absorbed more heat than their design accounts for. The detonation was not a sound so much as a rearrangement of the immediate environment, a pressure event that moved outward from the aircraft in a perfect sphere and encountered everything in its radius and expressed its opinion of those things without distinction or preference. Walsh and his two men became airborne. They traveled 15 feet through the air that had a moment before been standing still around them, and they landed on the concrete with the ungainliness of people who had not chosen to become airborne and had not prepared for landing. They lay still for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Walsh lifted his head from the tarmac and looked at the aircraft. What remained of the Super Hornet was a twisted skeleton of titanium and composite material fully engulfed the cockpit section at the center of a fire so intense that the air above it shimmered in a way that distorted everything beyond it into something that didn't look real. The heat radiating outward pushed the crash crews back to a perimeter that was too far away to be useful and the minimum distance that the heat permitted. The ejection seat was found 23 minutes later after the foam and water had beaten the fire down to manageable levels. It was empty. Blown clear of the aircraft at some point during the explosion, the harness webbing scorched to remnants, the frame warped by heat into geometry its designers had not intended. But there was blood on the fragments of canopies scattered across the concrete. Blood on the twisted metal of the seat rail. No body. Walsh stood in the wreckage with soot on his face and a ringing in both ears from the blast, and made the transmission that he would carry in his chest for the rest of his professional life. WSO is KIA. No remains recovered. Heat intensity of the fire. He stopped. His throat had closed around something. He cleared it and continued. There won't be anything left to recover. Lieutenant Riley Ashford was declared killed in action at 15:23 hours. Her mother, Catherine Ashford, would receive a knock on her door in San Diego that evening from a Navy chaplain whose face carried the expression that Navy chaplains learned to carry for exactly this purpose. The words he would speak to her were words she had heard before spoken to her 21 years ago about a different Ashford in the same measured cadence of institutional grief. She had survived that night. She would survive this one. But survival and wholeness are different conditions, and Catherine Ashford had spent 21 years understanding the distance between them. In a house overlooking the Pacific in Malibu, a 77-year-old man named Frank Ashford. Master Chief, Frank Ashford, United States Navy, retired 2 Silver Stars, a Navy Cross, a service record that occupied 3 pages of a file he had never read. After the day it was closed, would sit in his chair and look at the ocean without speaking. The people who knew him, which was not many people, because Frank Ashford had always been more comfortable with depth than breadth in his human relationships, would say later that they had never seen him look his age before that night. He looked his age that night and then some. And in Virginia Beach, a man named Dex Calloway would receive a phone call that would change everything. But that was still hours away. Because in the wreckage of the aircraft, in the space between what everyone believed had happened and what had actually happened, something impossible had occurred. And Riley Ashford was alive. The ejection seat mechanism had failed in a specific and entirely unintended way. The lateral stress of the sideways skid combined with the heat damage that had been accumulating in the aircraft's systems from the moment the left engine began its terminal failure sequence on approach had deformed the guide rails inside the cockpit in a configuration that the system's engineers had not modeled in their failure analysis. When the mechanism finally triggered activated by the aircraft's emergency systems as the fire crossed a threshold that the sensors interpreted as requiring immediate action, it did not fire upward along the intended vector. It fired sideways, outward and to the right at roughly 40 degrees from vertical, with enough force to drive Riley Ashford clear of the cockpit and send her through 30 feet of smoke-filled air in a direction that no one on the flight line was monitoring. She crossed those 30 feet in less than a second. She hit the debris pile at the edge of the crash zone, composite fragments. Insulation equipment shed from the aircraft during the skid, and the impact was total and comprehensive, and took every cubic inch of air from her body in a single instant. She bounced, once tumbled, and came to rest against the far face of the debris pile, and then the wing panel section still attached to the debris folded over her, and the burning insulation came down across that, and Riley Ashford disappeared from the visible world with a completeness that was almost deliberate in its thoroughness. Covered, hidden, gone. The fire was everywhere around her. The pain arrived not as a single event, but as a cascade, each injury announcing itself in the order that the nervous system processes structural damage priority given to the most critical, the rest queuing behind it in descending order of immediacy. 4 ribs on the left side had given way at some point during the impact, and she could feel the specific wrongness of broken bone ends moving against each other when she tried to breathe, a sensation so precisely wrong that it cut through the shock response that would otherwise have buffered it. Her left shoulder had separated the joint displaced from its socket in the impact, the nerve pain from this fact conducting its own sustained conversation that was independent of everything else happening in her body. The burns on her right forearm where the flight suit had melted against her skin in the last seconds before the canopy began to lift were a band of heat and damage that she filed under the category of things she would address when the category of immediately life-threatening had been cleared. And the smoke. The smoke was black and chemical and thick, filling the small enclosed space beneath the wing panel with the patient efficiency of something that understood it did not need to hurry. She tried to breathe through it. Her lungs, already compromised by the impact that had driven the air from them, declined to cooperate at the level she was requesting. She tried to call out. Nothing came. The mechanism for producing sound was not currently operational. She could hear voices. The crash crews reorganizing after the blast wave had moved through them, returning to their positions with the professional persistence of people trained to continue functioning after events that would stop untrained people entirely. She could hear the roar of foam hitting hot metal. She could hear radio traffic, the flat, clipped language of emergency response professional and efficient and entirely focused on what everyone present believed was a fire with no survivors. And then distinct above everything else, a sentence that she would hear in the quiet moments for years afterward: no survivors in the back seat. Pull back, secondary explosion risk. The footsteps moved away. The voices faded to background. And Riley Ashford lay in the dark, in the smoke, in the fire, and understood with a clarity that the situation had stripped of any ambiguity that they were leaving because they believed she was already gone. Not because they were wrong to believe it. Not because they were negligent or indifferent, but because the evidence available to them supported that conclusion and the people still alive needed their attention, and this was the correct allocation of resources, given what everyone on that flight line knew. They didn't know she was here. She was going to have to change that herself. This is how I die, she thought, with the specific flatness of a mind that has processed a situation completely and arrived at its conclusion. 28 years old, in the desert, alone. And then a voice arrived that was not the voice of the present moment. It was older than the present moment, stored in a room of her memory that she had been accessing her entire life without always knowing she was accessing it. Her grandfather's voice, patient and level, carrying the particular quality of a man who has encountered the worst the world produces and has made a decision about how to meet it. When they count you out, Riley, that's when you prove them wrong. She moved her right hand. The movement was not large, an inch, perhaps slightly more. It felt like moving something that had been fixed in place by forces larger than the ones she could currently bring to bear against them. The burned skin of her forearm screamed at the contact with the hot surface beneath her. She had already taken the injury. There was no new damage to prevent. She filed the pain under information rather than instruction and focused on the task. Her fingers found the edge of the wing panel. The metal was hot enough to blister skin that was not already blistered, which was a distinction without meaningful difference in her current situation. She pushed. The panel shifted. Fractionally. She pushed again. More. The world collapsed to that action, that fraction of movement, that single breath taken in the interval between efforts. Push. Breathe through the ribs. Push again. The ribs were conducting a formal and specific protest against the program she was running, but protests were information, and she had already received this particular information, and it was not going to change the program. She pushed until the panel moved enough. She pulled her legs through the gap. She got them beneath her. She crawled. The distance between the debris pile and the clear ground beyond was approximately 20 feet. She covered it in a duration of time that she could not have accurately reported afterward, and that felt while she was in it like a considerable fraction of her total life. She crawled through foam residue and burned fuel and debris that had no concern for her passage through it, and each movement was its own negotiation with the accumulated inventory of what the aircraft had done to her body, and she made each negotiation and moved forward and then made the next one. The debris field ended. Clear ground began. Then scrubland, the dry, tough desert vegetation that occupied the northern edge of the Nellis perimeter where the maintained tarmac gave way to the natural desert that surrounded it. She pulled herself into the brush and lay still. The crash crews were fully occupied. No one was looking north. No one had any reason to look north because the WSO was declared KYA and the fire was the priority, and everything that mattered was on the south side of the debris field. No one saw the ghost crawl out of the inferno. No one saw her disappear into the desert. She lay in the scrubland for several minutes, breathing carefully, shallowly, managing the ribs by limiting the depth of each breath to what they would permit without producing the grinding sensation that deeper breathing brought. She conducted a rapid inventory. Right arm functional, burn manageable. Left arm shoulder displaced the arm hanging at an angle that was wrong. In the way that displaced joints are wrong, the nerve pain from it constant and significant. Ribs 4, she estimated, though, confirmation would require imaging she did not currently have access to. Head, the specific quality of headache that indicated concussion. Burns right forearm, serious infection risk within hours in these conditions. She reached into the left chest pocket of her flight suit and found the PLB. The personal locator beacon was exactly where it always was, where it had been on every flight for 6 years, carried as a matter of standard procedure, never needed until now. She activated it in burst mode. Short transmissions at irregular intervals, harder to triangulate, still capable of reaching any friendly system on the monitoring frequency. Then she found a direction and began to move. 300 yards. That was all her body would give her before it made the decision for her and simply stopped cooperating. She found a depression in the rocky ground where a dry wash had cut a shallow channel, pulled herself into it, pulled brush over herself from the surrounding scrubland, and passed out. She woke to stars. The Nevada sky at night from the desert floor at sufficient distance from the base lighting to permit actual darkness. It was the kind of sky that required the removal of most human infrastructure to exist, and it was extraordinary. She oriented herself on the North Star from habit and lay still for a moment assessing. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees from the afternoon's hammer. She was cold in the specific way of a person whose flight suit was designed for cockpit conditions and not for desert exposure, which was a problem she would address. The shoulder was the most pressing structural issue. The ribs were a management problem. The burns were a timeline problem. The infection that was currently incipient would become critical within 24 to 48 hours without treatment. She activated her PLB and noted the time. Then she thought about the mission. She had been flying a reconnaissance pass over a section of desert 40 miles north of Nellis. A standard tasking logged and scheduled, nothing anomalous about it in the mission brief. She had flown the pass. She had taken photographs with the aircraft's imaging systems and transmitted them to base via the encrypted channel. She had reviewed the images before transmitting, as she always did, a habit from her first deployment, maintained since because it cost 2 minutes and had twice caught sensor artifacts that would have been reported as significant events. She had seen what the images contained, and 90 seconds after her transmission completed, she had received a recall order. Return to base immediately. Do not transmit further. 90 seconds. She thought about that interval. 90 seconds was not the response time of an institutional review process. It was the response time of a specific person who had been monitoring the incoming reconnaissance data, someone in real time who had been present at the reception point when her transmission arrived, who had seen what she had photographed and had understood immediately what it meant. 12 minutes after the recall order, her hydraulic system had failed. On a brand new aircraft with fewer than 200 flight hours, in a mode that the aircraft's own diagnostic systems flagged as outside all normal failure parameters. She reached into the breast pocket of her flight suit. The memory card was there, the small encrypted card onto which she had transferred a copy of the image files before takeoff, a practice she had started 2 years ago after a server failure cost a colleague an entire mission's worth of data. She had done it automatically that morning without knowing it would matter, without knowing that the images she was carrying would become the reason someone tried to kill her. She held the card in her palm. Then she closed her fist around it and lay back and looked at the stars and began to think carefully and systematically about what she was going to do next. Her grandfather's voice again, from a camping trip when she was 9 years old, crouched beside her in the dark while she tried and failed to start a fire. The desert will kill you 3 ways, little one. Heat, thirst, and giving up. You can beat the first 2 if you're smart enough. The third one is entirely your decision. She decided. She got up and went to work. The first priority was water. She had her survival kit, the full kit, not the abbreviated version that regulations technically permitted. Her grandfather had insisted on the full kit from the day she was commissioned, standing in her mother's living room in San Diego in his civilian clothes that somehow still looked like a uniform, making no request and offering no argument, simply stating that she would carry the full kit on every flight. She had complied without question because she had learned early that when Frank Ashford stated something in that tone, the reasons revealed themselves in retrospect. She found water in a seep at the base of a rock formation, 300 yards east of her initial position, water that tasted of minerals and old stone and was the finest thing she had consumed since the morning's coffee. She drank carefully, slowly, the amount her survival training specified, rather than the amount thirst was requesting, because the amount thirst requests in dehydration exceeds the amount the stomach can currently process, and the consequences of this mismatch were a problem she did not need to add to the existing inventory. The shoulder was next. She had been managing it by keeping the arm immobile, but immobility was not a sustainable solution, and the joint needed to be returned to its proper position before the surrounding tissue swelled sufficiently to make the procedure significantly more difficult. She found a section of rock face where the stone was vertical and solid and positioned herself against it with her left arm extended and her back against the surface. She breathed. 4 counts in. Hold. 8 counts out. The rhythm her grandfather had taught her when she was 8 years old on the first of the camping trips that she had understood in retrospect were not camping trips, but curriculum. Deliberate patient preparation for a life that Frank Ashford had understood would require certain capacities and had undertaken to install them in her before the life arrived. She pulled. The sound she produced in the moment the joint relocated was something below the register of screaming, more fundamental than that, less linguistic, the kind of sound that exists before language in the hierarchy of human expression. It left her and traveled across the desert and was absorbed by the dark and the distance and the silence of a landscape that had heard stranger things. The joint clicked into position. She sat against the rock for a long time afterward. Not resting was not currently a permitted activity. Processing, filing, continuing. She treated the burns with the antibiotic ointment from the survival kit. She improvised a compression wrap for the ribs from strips torn from the inner lining of her flight suit. She found a small cave system in the rocky elevation half a mile from the crash site and moved into it, pulling brush across the entrance in a pattern that would read as natural vegetation, rather than deliberate concealment to anyone passing without specific reason to look more carefully. Then she allowed herself 4 hours of unconsciousness. She woke to helicopter rotors. The sound was unmistakable, the distinctive low-frequency signature of an MH-60 Seahawk, a sound she had been hearing from cockpits and flight decks for 6 years, a sound that represented in normal circumstances exactly what she needed right now. She moved to the cave entrance and looked through the brush she had positioned in there. The helicopter was on a heading that would bring it within a mile of her position. She watched it come. She monitored its movement against the terrain, the angles, the logic of a search pattern. She knew what a search pattern looked like from above, and she knew what it looked like from below, and this was neither of those things. The helicopter maintained a steady heading and passed to the east of her position without deviation, without slowing, without the circling behavior that a crew does when they have detected a signal and are attempting to refine its location. It passed and was gone. It came back at 1340 from a different heading. Same result. A third pass at 1655. Same. Three passes. No deviation. No attempt to locate the signal her PLB was transmitting. Riley lay in the cave and thought about this with the careful, deliberate, analytical attention that had always been the way her training worked under pressure, not faster exactly, but more precise. Each step of the reasoning checked against the others, the conclusions held until they had been confirmed from multiple angles. The search and rescue crews were not finding her because someone had arranged for them not to find her. The same person who had issued the recall order 90 seconds after her transmission. The same person who had arranged the hydraulic failure. That person had sufficient operational authority within the base structure to redirect search and rescue operations away from the area where her PLB signal was originating. The architecture of what had been done to her was becoming clear. She had photographed something. The person responsible for what she had photographed had seen her transmission in real time, had recalled her had arranged a mechanical failure designed to kill her and look like an accident, and when she had survived the accident, improbably, through a failure mode no one had designed for that person, had arranged for the follow-on search to fail. She was supposed to be dead. She had failed to be dead. She was now the primary outstanding problem in someone's operational security equation, and that person had resources and authority and the will to use both. She reached into her breast pocket and held the memory card. Whatever was on this card, it was worth killing for. The question was whether it was worth dying for, and she had already answered that question by crawling out from under a burning wing panel, so the question was actually settled. She switched her PLB to continuous transmission. If someone wanted to find her, she was going to make it as easy as possible. She was betting on the existence of a receiver not controlled by whoever had tried to kill her, a bet that required faith in the size and complexity of the military's monitoring infrastructure, and in the statistical likelihood that not every node in that infrastructure had been compromised. It was not a comfortable bet. It was the only one available. The second night was harder than the first. The fever arrived in the early hours not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a biological process that has crossed a threshold and is now following its own logic. Infection predictably in the burns on her forearm, where the environment had access to damaged tissue. She took her temperature with the kit thermometer, 39.4, not immediately critical, moving in a direction that would become critical if the underlying cause was not addressed, which she could not address, which meant the number would continue to move. She managed it the way she managed everything, by doing what was available to do. More antibiotic ointment on the burns, maximum hydration, the breathing exercises that reduced her metabolic rate and therefore the rate at which the fever fed itself. She had been taught to treat the problem in front of her, and the problem in front of her was an infection, and she treated it with the tools she had, which were not adequate to the infection, but were better than nothing. She lay in the cave and thought about her father. Captain Sean Ashford had died when she was 6 years old. She had been told he died in Afghanistan, that he died doing important work, that he died the way he would have wanted to die, which was a thing adults said to children, when the truth was that nobody wanted to die, but the death had happened and meaning needed to be imposed on it, and this was the meaning that was available. She had understood very young that the precise circumstances of his death were not fully known to her family, that there were aspects of what had happened that remained officially obscure, and she had accepted this the way military families accept the obscurities that are native to that life. She had joined the Navy because of him. She had chosen aviation because she understood at 5 feet 4 inches and 118 pounds that certain physical realities were not going to yield to determination regardless of its quality, and so she had found the path available to her, and she had walked it. Her grandfather had taught her to shoot when she was 12, to read terrain when she was 9, to navigate by stars when she was 10, to manage pain and cold and heat and thirst, the practical curriculum of a man who understood that the world would make demands on her and intended to ensure she could meet them. She had never fully understood until this week that the curriculum was specific preparation rather than general philosophy. The third day brought the fever to 41 degrees. At 41, the world began to move in ways that were not entirely grounded in what was actually happening. The cave walls did things that cave walls did not do when her temperature was normal. Time became unreliable. She drifted between states of consciousness that she could not always distinguish from each other in the moment, though the transitions between them had a quality that let her know retroactively that she had been somewhere else. In the lucid intervals, she heard two more helicopter passes. Neither deviated. In the intervals between lucids, she thought about the photographs. She had seen them before transmitting. She had seen the compound and the vehicles and the crates with their military markings, and she had seen the two men standing in the compound yard with the relaxed posture of people who believed themselves completely unobserved. One in Air Force utilities, the rank insignia clear at the resolution her imaging system produced, and one in civilian clothing that communicated money in the specific way that certain fabrics and certain tailoring communicated. She had not been close enough or fast enough to read the name tape on the uniform. But the uniform was Air Force, and the compound was 40 miles north of Nellis. And whatever the two men had been conducting in that compound with those crates of military-marked equipment, it was worth killing a naval aviator to prevent her from reporting it. She pressed the memory card between her fingers in the dark and focused on the sound of her own breathing. Shallow managed each breath a conscious act, and she held on. She did not give up. That was the only variable she controlled, and she controlled it completely. 3,000 miles to the east at approximately the same hour that Riley Ashford was conducting her third conversation with the memory card in the dark of a Nevada cave, Commander Dex Calloway was cleaning his Sig Sauer P226 at the kitchen table of his Virginia Beach apartment. He was 59 years old. He had spent 36 of those years in the teams, had operated in more countries than he could list without consulting. Notes had made decisions under circumstances that the vast majority of human beings would never encounter, and had survived outcomes that many of the men beside him had not. He carried all of this the way well-used equipment carries its service history visibly in the architecture of his face and the economy of his movements, and the specific quality of his stillness, but without diminishment. The years had not reduced him. They had concentrated him, refined him, clarified the essential from the incidental. The table was covered with cleaning patches and the good smell of gun oil in the quiet of a Tuesday evening, and he was 30 days from retirement, actual retirement, the kind with a date attached and a ceremony scheduled, and a future that contained for the first time in 36 years the genuine possibility of stillness. His phone rang. Unknown number. The kind of number that in the civilian world was almost certainly spam, and in the world Dex had inhabited for 36 years was something else entirely. He answered. Calloway. Commander, this is Captain Alan Briggs, JSOC Operations Center. We have a situation. Dex set down the cleaning rod with the slow deliberateness of a man who has just received information that requires him to change the quality of his attention. JSOC called about missions. The word situation was a frame around something specific. I'm listening. We're picking up a PLB signal, personal locator beacon emergency frequency. The signal has been transmitting continuously for the past 8 hours. Location is Nellis Air Force Base area, rocky terrain north of the installation perimeter, approximately 6 miles from the runway complex. A pause. The kind of pause that existed to allow the next information to arrive with appropriate weight. The beacon is registered to a naval aviator who was declared killed in action approximately 60 hours ago. Dex's hand, which had been moving toward the cleaning rod again, from habit stopped. Declared KIA 60 hours ago, but the beacon is transmitting now. Continuously. For the past 8 hours. Name. There was a pause on the line. Not long, but specific in its quality. The pause of someone who knows that the name they are about to say is going to land differently than a name normally lands. Lieutenant Riley Ashford, Weapons Systems Officer F/A-18 Super Hornet. She went down at Nellis in a crash landing 2.5 days ago. The crash crews declared her killed in the post-crash fire. No remains were recovered due to the intensity of the burn. Dex sat very still. Outside his window, the Atlantic was moving toward its evening color. The gold that it found in the last hour before dark at this latitude in September, a color that he had come to associate over decades with a specific quality of endings that contained the seeds of something else. Captain, did you say Ashford? Yes, sir. Riley Ashford. That's correct. Dex stood up. The chair scraped against the tile floor. He walked to the window and put his hand on the frame and looked out at the water. Sean Ashford's daughter. A softer pause this time. I wasn't aware of the personal connection, sir. I apologize. JSOC has declined a rescue operation. The risk assessment. I know what the risk assessments say on an unconfirmed signal from a declared KIA. I've read those assessments. I've written versions of them. He kept his hand on the window frame and looked at the ocean. I'm volunteering. Personal request. Off the books if that's what it takes. Commander, you're scheduled for retirement in 30 days. Then this will be my last mission. He turned from the window. Are we doing this or not, Captain? A silence on the line. The specific silence of a decision being made at the level where decisions of this type are made. Stand by for orders, Commander. I'll make the call. The line went dead. Dex stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and looked at the disassembled side on the table. The cleaning patches. The gun oil. The quiet of a Tuesday evening that had just become something else entirely. He thought about Sean Ashford, about a valley in Afghanistan in 2004, and about the specific moment when he had gotten on the helicopter, because the order said to get on the helicopter, and about the way Sean had looked at him in the last seconds before the helicopter lifted, a look that Dex had spent 21 years interpreting and reinterpreting, and that still refused to settle into something he could live with. He thought about a 6-year-old girl with her father's eyes asking him if he had tried to save him. He had said yes. He had said he had tried everything. He picked up his phone and started making calls. The first call was to a phone number in Montana that he had not dialed in 14 months. It rang twice. Taggart, it's Calloway, I need you. A pause. Then, without elaboration or qualification, where and when. The second call was to a number in Maryland. One ring. Strand. Eli, it's Dex. I have a situation. A longer pause. Then, Sean's girl Dex stopped. How did you know? Because you haven't called me in a year and a half, and the only thing that would make you call me at this hour sounds like it involves Sean. Another pause. She's alive. PLB transmitting. 60 hours in the desert. Tell me where. The third call was to a number in Virginia 20 minutes from where he was standing. It answered immediately, as it always did, because the man who owned it kept his phone within arm's reach at all hours as a habit, so deeply installed it had become indistinguishable from instinct. Drummond. Wes, I need your brain and your equipment, tonight. Already packing, Drummond said. I've been watching the Nellis PLB traffic for the past 3 hours. I wondered when you'd call. The fourth call was to Texas. 4 rings, the only one who didn't answer immediately, because Grayson Pruitt was the only one who had genuinely tried to live a different life in the years since, and trying required some maintenance of the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. He answered on the 5th ring. Reeves. Gray, it's Dex. A very long silence. Sean's daughter. She's alive. She's been alone in the Nevada desert for 60 hours with injuries from the crash. Someone at Nellis is making sure search and rescue doesn't find her, and I don't know how far up the authority chain that someone sits. The silence on the line contained something being decided, something that had been sitting for several years in a space between the life Grayson Pruitt was building and the life he had lived, and that was now resolving. I'll be at your location in 4 hours, Pruitt said. They assembled at 3 in the morning in the back of a storage facility outside Virginia Beach, whose address was known to a diminishing and specific number of people. They arrived separately. They carried gear that reflected 36 years of accumulated understanding about what was necessary and what was theater. Dex looked at them across the table. Chief Boone Taggart, 53, 6 feet 4, 30 years in the teams, a service record in precision shooting that was classified at a level that precluded casual discussion. He had served with Sean Ashford in Iraq. He had been at the funeral. He had not spoken at the funeral because the words that were available to him were not the words the occasion deserved, and he had not been willing to use lesser ones. Corpman Eli Strand, 49, compact and still in the way of men who have learned that stillness conserves what spending wastes, 25 years keeping special operations personnel alive in conditions designed to prevent that outcome. He had been Sean's closest friend. He had been the one to close Sean's eyes. Wes Drummond, 46, thin, with the permanent slight squint of someone whose primary environment was screens and dark rooms, the finest signals intelligence analyst Dex had ever worked with. He had intercepted the communications that sent Sean's team into the valley where Sean died. An analytical error. He had identified it 40 minutes after the window for correction had closed. He had not slept well since. Grayson Pruitt, 51, sitting in the far corner, with the absolute stillness that was his baseline state, explosives and close quarters combat, and a versatility built by 2 decades of doing whatever the mission required. He had trained Sean Ashford. He had recommended him for advancement 4 times and been right each time. He had spoken at the funeral about duty and sacrifice, and the words had been true and had been insufficient. Riley Ashford is alive, Dex said. 3 days in the Nevada desert, injured, alone. No one is officially coming for her. He put a photograph on the table, Riley in her flight suit, young and serious, her father's eyes exactly. This is Sean's daughter. Taggart's jaw tightened. Strand looked at his hands. Drummond closed his eyes briefly and opened them. Pruitt did not move, but something in the set of his face shifted in the way that large things shift when they have found the position they were always going to occupy. JASOC has declined the operation, Dex continued. Risk assessment shows low probability of success, minimal support available, no air cover guarantee. I'm going anyway. This is not an order. Anyone who wants to leave, leave now. No questions, no judgment. No one moved. Taggart spoke first. His voice was the voice of Nevada rock in the category of things that required voice. Sean took 3 rounds in Fallujah that were heading for me. I've been carrying that debt for 19 years. I'm in. Strand. He was my closest friend. I'm in. Drummond. I sent his team into that valley. I'm in. Pruitt. I trained him. I told him he could be the best. He believed me. A pause. I'm in. Dex looked at each of them for a moment. Old men, broken men in the ways that men who have done what they had done are broken not structurally, not fundamentally, but in the specific places where the work had pressed hardest and left its marks. Men who had grandchildren and retirement accounts and lives that had been rebuilt carefully and imperfectly in the available space. Men who remembered what it meant to keep a promise. Wheels up in 4 hours, Dex said. Gear check in 2. We insert at 0200 local time, 6 miles from the signal. We move fast, we move quiet, and we bring her home. Taggart asked the question that occupied the room like a fifth presence. And if she's already gone when we get there, Dex's voice was flat and final, then we bring her home anyway. He looked at each of them. Nobody gets left behind this time. The MH-60 Seahawk lifted from a private airfield outside Virginia Beach at 0210 hours, flying dark 50 feet above the terrain, its rotors the only announcement of its passage, and that announcement designed to be as brief as possible. Inside the aircraft, 5 men sat with their equipment and their reasons in the specific interior silence that precedes operations of consequence. Dex ran through his gear in the focused way that 36 years had made automatic. M4A. A1 carbine with suppressor, SIG P226, night vision. Medical kit larger than standard at Eli's insistence, and Eli's instincts in this area had a better record than any other basis for the decision. Water. More water than his back wanted to carry, in exactly the amount that the situation required. In his left breast pocket, the photograph. 2 young men in desert camouflage with their arms around each other's shoulders grinning at a camera in Afghanistan in 2004, believing themselves to be the kind of people to whom the worst things do not happen. The photograph was folded soft at its creases from 21 years of being carried. Drummond spoke into the team comms barely above a breath. PLB signal is strong and consistent. She's at the position we mapped. She's alive. Pruitt from his position at the rear of the bay. Or someone wants us to think she is. We go anyway, Dex said. The helicopter banked slightly to correct its heading, and through the open door, the Nevada desert was dark and immense and patient, the stars above it undimmed by the absence of human light, the same stars under which Riley Ashford had been orienting herself for 3 nights, with a displaced shoulder and broken ribs and a fever that was climbing past the point where climbing needed to stop. She was there. She was alive. She had refused repeatedly and completely to be otherwise. The crew chief signaled 2 minutes. Dex grabbed the fast rope and looked back at his team. 4 men who had no operational reason to be here, who were here because of a reason that was older and more fundamental than operational calculus, who were here because 21 years ago a man named Sean Ashford had been someone worth being here for, and his daughter had inherited that worth without needing to earn it and had then gone ahead and earned it anyway. The crew chief signaled 30 seconds. 5 old soldiers lined up in the dark of the helicopter bay. The signal came, and they dropped into the Nevada night like smoke, like memory, like a promise 21 years overdue, arriving exactly when it was needed. The desert at 2 in the morning held a cold that was its own kind of serious. Not the aggressive cold of northern winters, not the wet cold of coastal nights. This was the dry, penetrating cold of high desert at elevation, the kind that found the joints first and worked inward from there, settling into old injuries and older bones with the patient thoroughness of something that understood it had time. 3 degrees Celsius. The rocky ground held none of the afternoon's heat, having surrendered it back to the sky in the efficient, indifferent way of stone that has been doing this for 10,000 years and has developed no emotional relationship with the process. The 5 men moved through it without speaking. Dex set the pace from the moment their boots found the ground, measured sustainable fast enough to close the 6 miles before Riley's condition moved past what Eli could manage in the field, controlled enough to avoid the noise that urgency produces in people moving through rocky terrain at night. They settled into the diamond formation without discussion, the geometry of it installed by years of shared work into reflex rather than thought. Taggart on point 30 meters ahead, his Mark 13 carried across his chest with the ease of something that was part of him rather than equipment he was operating. Pruitt covering the rear. Drummond in the center with the PLB signal displayed on the device strapped to his forearm, a small green dot against a topographic overlay that shifted with each step they took toward it. Strand moved on Dex's left and did not speak and did not need to. He had been doing his inventory since the helicopter IV line's broad-spectrum antibiotics in 2 formulations. Because sepsis had opinions about single-agent treatment, morphine measured, and ready thermal regulation materials, the full catalog of what a body that had spent 72 hours alone in the desert with serious injuries was likely to need from someone qualified to provide it. He had treated Sean Ashford's body when they finally recovered it from the valley in Afghanistan. He had closed Sean's eyes and noted the expression on his face, which was not an expression of fear or surprise or pain, but something more settled than any of those things, the expression of a man who had been moving towards something important and had been stopped before he reached it, but had not been stopped from trying. He was not going to close Riley Ashford's eyes tonight. That was the only version of tonight he was constructing. 1 kilometer and Taggart raised a closed fist. Freeze. Everyone stopped. No sound except the desert. The small sounds of wind across rock and the distant settling of cooling stone and the breathing of 5 men who had learned to make their breathing inaudible in circumstances that required it. Dex raised his night vision and scanned the terrain to the northeast. 6 men, 400 meters out, moving south on a heading that would take them past the team's position at approximately 200 meters. Moving in a spread formation with the informal readiness of people looking for something specific rather than executing a security protocol. Dark civilian clothing, no unit identification visible. Weapons carried at the low ready. Not base security, not military police, not search and rescue. These were people who worked for money rather than obligation. And the money they were currently earning was connected to ensuring that what was in the Nevada desert north of Nellis remained in the Nevada desert north of Nellis. Dex held the closed fist. 60 seconds, 90. The 6 men moved through their heading and passed to the northeast and were absorbed by the darkness in the distance. Taggart looked back, question in the gesture. Dex signaled forward. They moved. 3 kilometers into the terrain changed character. The relatively flat desert floor surrendered to the rocky elevation that the topographic data had shown boulders large enough to navigate around rather than over dry wash channels that cut unpredictably across the route loose scree that shifted underfoot and made the kind of noise that traveled in cold air to distances that made it worth managing. The team adjusted without breaking pace. Each man found the line through the obstacles that balanced forward movement against sound discipline, the calculation made and remade with each step in the way that long practice makes automatic. Pruitt was managing something in his left side that he did not report, and that was visible only in the slight asymmetry of his movement to anyone who knew what his baseline movement looked like. The shoulder that had been operated on twice in the past decade, the legacy of Ramadi, and a door breach that had gone wrong in a way that door breaches occasionally go wrong, regardless of how well they are executed. He absorbed it in the way he absorbed things that could not be changed completely privately, without performance, without any adjustment to his pace or his position. At 5 kilometers, Drummond spoke into the team comms at minimum volume. Signal strengthening. Bearing 035, 200 meters. The rocky hills rose before them against the star-filled sky. The cave systems the geological survey had shown were in the elevated terrain ahead, dark openings in darker rock indistinguishable from each other. At this distance, any one of them a place a person might choose to hide. The PLB signal was narrowing to a specific point within that terrain, and Drummond's forearm display was refining its position with each step they took toward it. Then Taggart stopped again. Open palm this time, the slower signal the developing situation rather than the immediate threat. Dex moved forward to his position. The cave entrance. It was exactly the kind of feature that a person could walk past without registering a crack in the hillside barely wide enough for a person turned sideways, partially blocked by brush, that had been arranged with a naturalism that was to a trained eye that was specifically looking fractionally too deliberate to be entirely coincidental. The branches were positioned to follow the logic of how brush grows the angles consistent with natural growth patterns, the overall effect convincing to anyone passing without reason to look more carefully. Someone had placed those branches. Someone who had done it with a dislocated shoulder and 4 broken ribs and whatever the burns on her forearm were contributing to the workload within hours of a crash that had been designed to kill her. Someone who had been thinking clearly enough under those conditions to consider concealment before comfort, to invest the time and the pain cost of making her hiding place look like it wasn't. Dex looked at the entrance for a moment, then he looked at Taggart and made the assignments Eli and Grayson outside perimeter security. Dex, Taggart, and Drummond go in. Taggart went first. He turned sideways and moved through the entrance with the practiced economy of a large man who had spent his career in spaces designed for smaller people and had developed a specific methodology for navigating them. The passage beyond was narrow for 15 feet before it widened the rock cold and damp against the hands. Drummond activated the low-intensity infrared lamp that painted the space in the green-gray of night vision without producing visible light outside the cave. Taggart cleared the passage in the small chamber beyond it and signaled. They came through. The chamber was roughly 15 feet across the ceiling, irregular above them, the floor covered with fine desert dust that had accumulated over geological time. The smell of old stone and dust and something else, something organic, the specific scent of human presence under stress, sweat, and infection, and the particular chemical signature of a fever burning through a body that was working very hard to remain functional. And against the far wall, Riley Ashford. Dex had prepared himself on the helicopter and during the 6-mile approach for a range of things he might find. He had prepared himself for the possibility that she was gone. He had prepared himself for critical condition, unconscious, non-responsive, past the point where field medicine could make the difference. He had prepared himself for the psychological state of someone who had been alone in the desert for 3 days with serious injuries and no contact, and the knowledge that the people who should have been looking for her were actively not looking. He had not prepared himself for what he actually found because what he actually found was not something that preparation could have fully anticipated. She was awake. She was propped against the far wall with her back against the rock and her legs extended and her flight suit torn and stained with the accumulated documentation of 72 hours of survival. Her left arm rested at the slight wrong angle that spoke of an injury addressed but not resolved. Her face was pale in the infrared light and sheened with the specific moisture of a high fever, and the shadows beneath her eyes were deep enough to constitute damage rather than fatigue. But her eyes were open and clear, and the M9 pistol in her right hand was pointed at the cave entrance. Without tremor, the sight picture held with the practiced steadiness of someone who had been maintaining this position long enough to have made it comfortable. Her shooting hand was steady. Dex registered this with the specific attention it deserved. 28 years old, 4 broken ribs, a fever that his hand when he touched her forehead a minute later would tell him was burning well above 40 degrees. 72 hours alone, and her shooting hand was steady. Identify yourselves, her voice was raw. The smoke inhalation and the dehydration had reduced it to its fundamental frequency, stripped of the resonance that normal hydration and healthy tissue provide. But it was not uncertain. It was not the voice of someone who had lost track of who they were or what they were doing. It was the voice of someone who had decided at some point in the past 3 days exactly who they were going to be in this situation and who was being that person with complete consistency. Dex raised both hands, his M4 angled away, non-threatening, the gesture of someone who wanted to be seen as what he was. With his right hand, he reached slowly into the left breast pocket of his kit and found the photograph, the one he had carried for 21 years, the one that was soft at the creases from the handling, the one that showed 2 young men in desert camouflage in Afghanistan, believing themselves to be the kind of people to whom the worst things did not happen. He held it toward her in the infrared light. She looked at it. In the silence of this cave, the sound of her breathing was audible, shallow. Careful, the managed breathing of someone working around broken ribs with the practiced awareness of someone who has been doing it for days. She looked at the photograph and something happened in her face that was not quite recognizable as a specific emotion. Because it was too large and too multiple to be any single thing, it was the expression of someone receiving information that rearranges the structure of what they believed was true and doing this rearranging in real time. The hand holding the pistol began to tremble. Not the fine tremor of fever. Something different. Something that had been held in place by the professional composure that 3 days of necessary survival had required, and that was now releasing because the situation that had made it necessary had changed. The pistol lowered. Uncle Dex, her voice broke on the second word, split open along a fault line that had existed since she was 6 years old and had been held together by a combination of her mother's resilience and her grandfather's lessons and her own considerable will. Mom always said you were just a story she made up. I'm 21 years late, Dex said. He crossed the chamber in 3 steps and crouched beside her. But I keep my promises. She looked at him with her father's eyes. The specific directness of Sean Ashford's gaze, unchanged by time or generation, looking out of a face that was pale with fever and marked by 3 days of serious survival. For a moment, she looked exactly the age she had been the last time he had seen her, which was 6, which was the age at which she had asked him the question that had been living in him ever since. "I knew someone would come," she said. "I kept telling myself I knew you'd come." Then she reached into the breast pocket of her flight suit with fingers that were not doing what she was asking them to do as precisely as she was asking them to do it. And she found the memory card and she pressed it into his palm with a grip that was urgent and deliberate and intended to transfer not just the object, but the understanding of what the object was. The crash wasn't an accident. Her voice was dropping now, the fever pulling at it from below the resources that had been sustaining consciousness beginning to redirect toward more fundamental requirements. "Colonel Hale, Douglas Hale, Air Force Nellis Director of Operations. The photographs I took photographs during the reconnaissance pass. There was a compound 40 miles north. Weapons, American weapons, in crates with military markings. And Hale was there, standing next to a civilian. Whatever they were doing, he knew I'd photographed it. The recall order came 90 seconds after my transmission." She paused. The effort of the speech was visible. The hydraulic failure was 12 minutes later, and the search and rescue. Her eyes found his. "Someone made sure they wouldn't find me." Then the fever won the argument, and her eyes closed and she was gone, her breathing continuing in the shallow, careful pattern, the M9 loose in her hand, the fight she had been running for 3 days, suspended temporarily while her body addressed its most urgent priorities. Drummond was already in the chamber. Eli was coming through the entrance behind him. Dex moved back to give Eli the space he needed and watched the corpsman's hands move through the assessment with the speed of someone who had rehearsed this 1,000 times, not frantically, but with the focused efficiency of expertise applied under urgency, each action leading directly to the next without wasted motion. "Sepsis onset," Eli said, his voice the clinical register of a man reporting findings. "Fever at 41, possibly higher. Dehydration severe. She's been managing her water intake intelligently, but there are limits to what the available source could provide. 4 fractured ribs, left side self-splinted." He paused. He was looking at the improvised compression wrap Riley had made from her flight suit lining. "This is actually competent field work," he continued. "Left shoulder reduced. Someone did that." He looked at the mark on the cave wall where the rock showed the specific scoring of something heavy pressing against it with sustained force. "She did it herself." Taggart from the cave entrance, where he was maintaining watch, said nothing, but the line of his jaw changed. "Burns right forearm, 3rd-degree infection, advanced. This is the primary driver of the sepsis. Concussion consistent with the crash impact." Eli looked up at Dex. "She needs a hospital, not in 4 hours. Now. We're 6 miles from extraction." "I know. I'm telling you what she needs, not asking you to produce it from nothing." He was already starting the IV line, finding the vein that the dehydration had collapsed to near invisibility, the needle placement precise and immediate. "She made it 72 hours alone. She can make 6 miles if we carry her correctly and move at a pace the situation requires." He looked at Dex. "Move fast." Drummond had moved to the cave entrance to get adequate signal for his equipment. He was looking at the memory card reader attached to his tactical laptop, the files already loading high-resolution reconnaissance photographs. Timestamp, showing the day of Riley's mission. Metadata intact. The full image set that she had transferred before takeoff and carried through the crash and the explosion and 3 days of desert survival in the breast pocket of her flight suit. He scrolled through the initial images. Compound, vehicles. Then the crates and Drummond's scrolling stopped. "Dex." His voice had changed register. Not urgency, something quieter than urgency, the tone of someone who has found what they were looking for and found it larger than expected. "Look at this." Dex moved to him. The image on the screen was high resolution and unambiguous. American military weapons crates, their inventory markings clear at the imaging system's resolution, stacked in the yard of a desert compound that had no legitimate operational reason to contain them. And beside the crates, 2 men, one in Air Force utilities with rank insignia, readable at this resolution, one in civilian clothing that communicated money in the specific way of certain fabrics and certain tailoring. "Colonel Douglas Hale," Drummond said, indicating the uniform. He moved his finger to the civilian. "Victor Sorel, Serbian national, private arms broker operating for approximately 20 years. On the CIA's priority watch list, suspected of supplying weapons to non-state actors across 3 continents. Never prosecuted, because his operational security has historically been exceptional." He looked at Dex. Until now. Dex looked at the image, at the easy business-like posture of the two men in the compound yard, at the crates bearing the markings of the United States military, at the 40 miles of Nevada desert between this compound and the base from which the weapons had almost certainly originated. How long, he said. Drummond had been building this since the moment Dex had said Hale's name. The parallel processing that was native to how his mind worked had been running financial traces and operational correlations in the background since the helicopter, and what it had assembled in that time was already significant. 15 years minimum, Drummond said, probably longer. Every theater where American weapons have turned up in unauthorized locations over the past decade and a half, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, smaller operations across the region, Hale was in the operational coordinator role for the source theater in every case. He scrolled to a financial overlay he had been building from intercepts. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, money moving through channels designed to be opaque. The total, based on what I can trace right now, is north of $50 million. Taggart had left his position at the entrance and was standing behind Drummond, reading the screen over his shoulder. His face held the expression that it held when he was processing something that was going to require physical response, and he was managing the timeline. There's more, Drummond said. He had been building to this. He had known it was there since the financial traces had begun to reveal their structure, and he had been moving toward it the way you move towards something that needs to be said because it is true and because the people you are standing with need to know it. The file Riley assembled, she didn't just photograph the meeting. She'd been collecting anomalies for weeks. There's a secondary file on this card. He opened it, a list, names, ranks, account numbers, transactions. 11 other individuals, Drummond said, taking money from Hale's network, officers in positions that explain why the system has been unable to self-correct. The person who receives MCCIS reports and determines their priority. The person who assigns investigation resources at the Inspector General's office. 2 people at the Defense Intelligence Agency who decide which signals are worth acting on. He paused. Riley figured this out before the mission. She knew she was flying into something dangerous. She prepared this in case she didn't come back. The cave was very quiet. Dex looked at the secondary file, at the names and ranks, at the architecture of something that had been built specifically to defeat the mechanisms that were supposed to detect it, each piece placed with the understanding of how the institutional system worked and where its vulnerabilities lived. 15 years of this, $50 million. And at every point where exposure should have been possible, a person who had been paid to ensure that exposure did not occur. And then Drummond said the thing that had been building beneath everything else he had said. The ambushes. His voice was quiet and specific. The ones where our people walked into positions that should not have been known. The ones where the intelligence failures were too precise to be explained by the fog of war. He looked at Dex. Hale was selling position data, movement schedules, the operational parameters of special operations units in theater. He paused. Some of those ambushes weren't intelligence failures. They were transactions. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something that did not have a clean name, grief and rage at such proximity that they had merged into something that required a different word, a word that most languages do not contain, because most languages are built by people who do not routinely encounter this specific combination. Taggart turned away from the screen and walked to the cave entrance and stood looking out at the desert and the stars. His hands were at his sides. He did not make fists. He simply stood there and let the information settle into the structure of what he knew and what it meant, the way very large things settle when there is no choice but to let them. Dex thought about Sean Ashford, about an anomaly in a weapons manifest that Sean had noticed and had been going to report, about the air support that had struck the wrong coordinates in a valley in Afghanistan in 2004. He had spent 21 years carrying the weight of that outcome as his own failure, as the failure of a man who had followed orders when instinct said to stay, who had made the institutional choice when the human choice was still available. He had built a structure of guilt around that interpretation and had lived inside it. The structure was wrong. Sean had not died because Dex had followed orders. Sean had died because Douglas Hale had needed him dead, had used the legitimate mechanisms of the military system to produce that outcome with the precision of a man who understood those mechanisms completely, and Dex's compliance with the extract order had been genuine and had been used. He had been an instrument of what had happened without knowing it. The guilt he had been carrying was real, but its address was wrong. It belonged to Hale, not to Dex, had always belonged to Hale, and the 21 years that Dex had spent directing it inward had been 21 years spent in the wrong room. He looked at the memory card in his palm. "We need to get her to a hospital," he said, "and then we need to end this." They rigged the litter from their ponchos, and Taggart's tactical webbing functional solid, not elegant, which was the only specification the situation required. Eli configured the IV line with the extension that would allow him to monitor it during movement. Taggart and Pruitt took the front, Dex and Strand took the rear. Drummond moved slightly ahead, monitoring the PLB signal for secondary confirmation of position, monitoring the radio frequencies for the coordinated search traffic he had been tracking since insertion. They lifted Riley Ashford off the cave floor and turned toward the exit. Outside, the Nevada desert received them with its customary indifference, cold and dark and vast and patient. 6 miles of rocky terrain between the cave and the extraction point, between Riley and the hospital she needed, between the beginning of what she had started and whatever it would become. They began. The carry was its own category of hard. Dex had made the calculation on the helicopter, and it had been an honest calculation. 6 miles was manageable. The weight was manageable, the terrain was navigable. What he had underweighted in the calculation was the cumulative toll of the past several hours on bodies that were 59 and 53 and 49 and 46 and 51 respectively, bodies that had been in the desert since 0200 hours and had covered the incoming 6 miles already before they picked up the litter and began covering the outgoing 6. His lower back was conducting a sustained conversation. His knees were less subtle. He noted both and continued, because the noting and the continuing were the only two responses available, and the second one was non-negotiable. At 1.4 kilometers, Drummond raised his hand in the slower signal, developing situation. He moved to a rock outcropping and crouched, and Dex came forward to his position. A vehicle 800 meters south moving slowly across the desert floor with its headlights extinguished, navigating by infrared lighting visible through the NVGs. 2 men in the bed with weapon scanning, moving in the specific pattern of someone executing a grid search with the intention of covering the terrain systematically rather than randomly. Third vehicle in a coordinated pattern, Drummond said below a breath. "I've been tracking their radio traffic. They know she's out here. They know someone came for her." He paused. "Hales people." Dex watched the vehicle's heading. Current trajectory would take it to approximately 350 meters, at closest approach close enough to make noise discipline, critical far enough that if the team held still and the vehicle did not deviate, they would pass without contact. He held the open palm signal. They held. The vehicle moved through its heading. 350 meters. 300. Dex watched the infrared light sweep across the terrain. It crossed the rocky feature they were behind, paused, moved on. The vehicle continued south. The engine sound faded. The desert resumed its silence. "Clear," Drummond said. They lifted the litter and moved. At 3 kilometers, Eli spoke. "She's running higher." His hand had been against Riley's neck and wrist in the continuous monitoring posture he had maintained since they left the cave, the ambient assessment of a man for whom this was a background process as natural as walking. 41, maybe 41.5. "Sepsis is accelerating faster than I'd like." "What do you need?" "Faster, but faster costs us the other thing." "We gain time where the ground allows," Dex said. "Every clear stretch, we double the pace. Rocky sections, we take what the terrain gives." He looked at Eli. "She made it 3 days alone. She can make 3 miles if we don't give her reason to stop." Eli accepted this, and they pushed. The rhythm that teams find after enough time carrying a shared weight settled over them somewhere between 3 and 4 kilometers. The unconscious synchronization of movement, where each man's adjustments become part of a shared system, the litter stabilizing naturally, the pace finding its sustainable maximum without negotiation. Taggart was carrying his end one-handed for stretches, the other hand managing his rifle with the casual competence of someone for whom this was not an exceptional physical demand. Pruitt was absorbing his shoulder with the silence that was his characteristic response to things that could not be changed. At 4.8 kilometers, Riley's fever spiked. Eli read it in his fingertips before the thermometer confirmed it. "She's crossing 42. We have minutes, not hours." He looked at the terrain ahead. "How far?" 1.2 kilometers to the LZ. "We run." They ran, not the run of urgency and panic, the run of people who have decided that the cost of running is acceptable relative to the cost of not running, and who are executing that decision with the control that keeps running from becoming falling. At 1 kilometer out, Drummond raised his fist. Full stop. Over the ridge to the east, 2 vehicles were coming fast. Their headlights on now, full illumination, the pretense of a covert search abandoned. They had either detected movement or the search grid had converged on their position, And either way, the result was the same men with weapons, closing distance, 100 meters per 15 seconds at their current approach speed. 6 contacts in the first vehicle, at least 4 in the second. Drummond reported his NVGs on the approaching headlights. Armed, moving with intent. Dex made the assessment in the time it took to make it. 1.2 kilometers to the LZ. Riley running out of time. 2 vehicles of armed contractors converging. Taggart was already moving the Mark 13 coming up his body, finding the prone position behind a rocky feature with the fluid ease of something so deeply practiced it had become structural. He looked through the scope. The thermal imaging painted the approaching vehicles in white against the cold desert background. 2 vehicles, 2 drivers. Kill the vehicles, we stop the approach. His voice was the functional tone of a man describing a mechanical problem. Range is 800 and closing. Engines only if you can manage it, Dex said. I can manage it. The Mark 13 spoke once. The engine block of the lead vehicle expressed its opinion of a 50 caliber round at 800 meters in the way that engine blocks express such opinions conclusively and immediately, the vehicle decelerating from 30 miles an hour to 0 in a duration that the occupants experienced as considerably more violent than the physics strictly required. The second shot followed the first by 4 seconds. The second vehicle's engine reached the same conclusion. Both vehicles stopped. Men began dismounting, angry, unarmed, and on foot now and covering ground faster than the vehicles had been. LZ in 1 kilometer, Dex said. Move. They moved. Litter up pace at the maximum the terrain permitted. Taggart coming off his position and rejoining the formation, his work with the long rifle complete for the moment. Drummond was on the radio. Nightbird, Nightbird. This is Tombstone. We have disabled, hostile vehicles. Contacts on foot, pursuing packages critical and deteriorating. We need that bird at the LZ in 8 minutes. How copy? Static. Then, Tombstone, Nightbird. Copy your situation. Multiple contacts in the area airspace is active. We are inbound. ET. 9 minutes. Pop smoke at LZ. 9 minutes. At 500 meters from the LZ, the pursuing contractors closed to effective weapons range and expressed their displeasure with this development in the most direct available manner. Rounds snapped past, the specific sound of rounds moving through air at velocity, the sound that divides people who have heard it before from people who have not by the degree to which it requires conscious management. Defensive, Dex said. Protect the litter. Taggart went to a knee and began working through the pursuers with the systematic calm of a man who was doing something he had done many times and that held no surprise for him. Each round from the Mark 13 was a decision made and executed, not spray and hope, but specific, deliberate, the arithmetic of precision under fire. He dropped 2 men in the first 30 seconds, wounded a third who had been working to flank left. The others went to cover. Dex and Drummond covered the approach from the south, controlled bursts, making the available ammunition serve the purpose of keeping heads down rather than the purpose of creating kills. Because keeping heads down was the requirement, and kills were an expensive way to achieve it when the primary goal was distance. Pruitt, working from the right flank with the arm that was reporting an ongoing situation in his shoulder, had positioned himself with the litter behind a rock feature that provided the best available cover and was managing the right approach with the economy of fire that conserved what the situation would not allow him to replenish. Eli had not fired a shot. Eli was managing Riley's IV line and monitoring her vitals and doing the thing that he had decided at some point on the incoming march was his contribution to this particular firefight, keeping Riley Ashford alive, while the other 4 kept the people who wanted her dead at a distance sufficient to allow this. He was not wrong about the allocation. 7 minutes, Drummond called from his position, the information delivered between trigger pulls in the flat tone of a man multitasking at a level that most people would find incompatible with any of the individual tasks. Then Pruitt said, I'm hit. He said it without drama. The flat declarative of a man reporting a factual development in the same tone he would use to report a change in wind direction. Dex turned. Pruitt was still in position, still covering the right flank, but his right hand had left his weapon and pressed against his lower left abdomen, and the dark stain spreading between his fingers was moving at a rate that communicated several things about its severity simultaneously. Eli, Dex said, I see it. Eli was already moving the IV extension, allowing him to maintain Riley's treatment while he repositioned to Pruitt. His hands found the wound in the specific way of hands that have found wounds under fire before the assessment rapid and the response immediate. Not arterial, deep tissue, significant bleed manageable with pressure. He looked at Pruitt. You're in the game. Pruitt's right hand returned to his weapon. The MH-60 came over the southern ridge, in the way that helicopters arrive when they are flown by people who understand the geometry of a ground firefight and the protection that low altitude provides fast and low and purposeful, the minigun in the door already oriented toward the last known positions of the pursuing force. What the minigun expressed to those positions was expressed at 6,000 rounds per minute, which is a rate of expression that tends to conclude conversations. The desert erupted in geysers of sand and rock. The pursuing force found cover or found outcomes. The fire directed at the team ceased with the abruptness of something that had been switched off. The helicopter touched down. 10 seconds on the ground. Riley's litter went in first, Taggart and Drummond lifting it through the door, Eli following immediately and connecting her to the aircraft's medical systems with the speed of someone who had pre-planned every connection and needed no time to find them. Pruitt went next, Taggart supporting his right side, the transition from desert floor to helicopter deck, executed with the care that a man in Pruitt's condition required. Drummond pulled himself up. Taggart was last man from the ground, the Mark 13 still in his hands covering the door for the 3 seconds it took him to reach it. Dex was at the door when something made him turn. Not a sound, not a movement. The specific quality of being observed, the primitive recognition that something with intent is looking in your direction. Through the settling dust and the smoke from the disabled vehicles and the strobing of the helicopter's rotor wash across the desert floor, a black SUV sat at the edge of the available light. And beside it, a man in Air Force Utilities binoculars raised, watching. Not commanding, not directing, watching. The posture of someone monitoring a situation they have authored, tracking its outcome. Even at 300 meters through the dust, in the dark, Dex knew who it was. Their eyes met across that distance for less than 2 seconds. An understanding passed between them that was complete and bilateral and wordless. The specific recognition of two people who have just identified each other as the principals in something that has not yet reached its conclusion. Hale lowered the binoculars, reached for a radio. Calloway, Taggart's voice from the door. Now, Dex turned and got on the helicopter. The MH-60 lifted, immediately gaining altitude in the aggressive climb of a pilot who wants vertical distance between his aircraft and the ground as quickly as physics allows. Below, the desert fell away, the disabled vehicles, the scattered positions of the pursuing contractors, the black SUV at the edge of the light, Hale growing smaller as the helicopter climbed, still watching. Dex slumped against the bulkhead and ran his hand along his left leg, where something had grazed him at some point during the firefight. Not deep, not arterial, but bleeding in the specific way of a wound that wanted acknowledgement. He pressed his hand against it and shifted his attention to the aircraft's interior. Pruitt was in the forward section of the bay, with Eli's hands managing his abdominal wound, with the focused efficiency of a man doing the most important work available to him. Pruitt was pale but conscious, his eyes moving with the deliberate attention of someone who is monitoring their own condition as an act of will. His color was below where it should be, and stable in a way that meant the next hour was navigable. Taggart sat across from them with his rifle case across his knees, watching Pruitt with an expression that contained more than his face usually permitted. Drummond had his laptop open and was working. And Riley Ashford lay on the litter connected to the aircraft's medical equipment, her breathing shallow and managed the fever still burning through her body continuing the campaign. It had been running for 3 days, the stubborn, costly, essential campaign of remaining alive. Eli looked up from Pruitt, across the bay at Dex. The look communicated what the professional register they were operating in did not permit to be stated directly. The question of whether Riley was going to make it was not yet answered. The next several hours would answer it. What they did with the next several hours would be part of what answered it. Tell the pilot, Dex said to Drummond. Not Nellis. Nellis is compromised. Las Vegas Sunrise Hospital, civilian facility outside Hale's direct operational reach. Drummond was already on the intercom. Dex opened his hand. The memory card was still there, pressed into his palm, since the cave, since Riley had transferred it to him with the urgency of someone who understood that what it contained mattered more than what was happening to her body. He looked at it in the dim utility lighting of the helicopter bay. $50 million, 15 years, 11 accomplices, hundreds of ambushes. Sean Ashford dead in a valley in Afghanistan because he had been going to file a report about a weapons manifest anomaly. And Riley Ashford alive in a helicopter over the Nevada desert because she had refused repeatedly and completely and at significant cost to be otherwise. Wes, Dex said. Drummond looked up from the laptop. When we land, before anything else, I need you to tell me exactly what we're dealing with. Drummond looked at the card, looked at Dex. I already know what we're dealing with, he said. I've been looking at it since the cave. He paused. The question isn't what we're dealing with. The question is what we're going to do about it. Dex looked out the open door at the Nevada desert below, receding as the helicopter climbed to cruise altitude, the darkness spreading back toward the place where they had found Riley, toward the cave where she had held a pistol steady for 3 days and waited for exactly the right person to come through the entrance. He thought about Hale on the radio beside the black SUV. Hale was expecting them to go to ground, to protect Riley, treat the wounded, wait for the institutional machinery to process what Drummond was sending through official channels. He was expecting the standard defensive posture, the posture of people who believed that the system would eventually function correctly if given enough information and enough time. He was going to be wrong about that. Because Dex Calloway had spent 21 years following orders and trusting the chain of command and directing his grief inward at a story that turned out to be false, and he was not going to spend the next 6 hours doing the same thing. The lights of Las Vegas appeared on the horizon, growing as the helicopter descended toward them, brilliant and various and human in all the ways that the desert around them was not a city that had decided as a matter of foundational identity that darkness was a condition to be addressed rather than accepted. They had a hospital to reach. They had a man to find. They had a broadcast to make. And for the first time in 21 years, Dex Calloway was not going to wait for permission. Sunrise Hospital received them at 0031 hours with the organized urgency that serious trauma produces in people who have trained for it, not the frantic urgency of crisis, but the focused economical urgency of a system doing what it was built to do at the level it was built to do it. The helicopter had set down on the rooftop pad 6 minutes earlier, and in those 6 minutes, Drummond had given the incoming trauma team everything they needed: vitals, trend injury, inventory, field treatment, administered the timeline of what had happened and when. The specific and dangerous convergence of sepsis and dehydration and structural damage that had been accumulating for 72 hours, while the people responsible for finding Riley Ashford had been actively ensuring she stayed lost. The trauma team took the litter at the rooftop door and moved with it at the pace that communicated clearly that they understood the situation and had already allocated the resources it required. Eli walked beside this gurney for 30 feet, his brief, rapid, and specific, the professional shorthand of one medical person transferring critical information to another, each word chosen for maximum density of content in minimum time, because time was what the next several hours would spend more carefully than anything else. Then the doors closed and Riley Ashford disappeared into the hospital, and the 5 men who had carried her through 6 miles of Nevada desert stood in the corridor and existed for the first time in several hours without an immediate task consuming their attention. Pruitt was taken in the opposite direction by a trauma nurse who assessed his abdominal wound with a look that communicated professional concern calibrated to its actual severity, serious but not catastrophic. The look that a good nurse gives when they want the patient to understand that they are being taken seriously without encouraging the particular kind of alarm that makes patients difficult to work with. He walked rather than was carried. The nurse did not argue with this. She had dealt with this category of patient before and understood that certain negotiations were not worth having. Taggart sat on a bench against the wall, set his rifle case on the floor beside it, and looked at his hands. They were steady. They were always steady. It was one of the things that made him what he was professionally, and it was a quality that had never been entirely separable from the person rather than the operator. He turned his hands over, once looked at the palms, and then put them on his knees and looked at the opposite wall instead. Drummond found a corner with a power outlet, opened his laptop, and disappeared into the work that had been building since the cave financial traces. Operational timelines. The architecture of 15 years of institutional betrayal rendered visible through the patient application of the specific skills that Wes Drummond had spent his career developing. Strand leaned against the wall beside the trauma bay doors, arms crossed, watching the gap at the bottom of the doors, in the way that a person watches for the only information currently available. He had done what he could do with what he had in the field. The hospital was doing what the field could not. He understood this intellectually, and the intellectual understanding did not reduce by any measurable amount the need he felt to remain in proximity to those doors. Dex stood apart from all of them, the memory card in his closed fist, and thought about Douglas Hale. He thought about a man who had been operating for 15 years behind the accumulated protection of rank and reputation and institutional trust, the specific kind of trust that a decorated military career builds, the way geological processes build stone slowly and invisibly in layers that become structural over time. He thought about the audacity required to do what Hale had apparently been doing, to occupy a position of authority within a system designed to protect the country while systematically selling that system's capabilities to the people it was designed to protect against. Not from desperation, not from ideology, from preference, from the calculation that the money was available and the risk was manageable, and the institutional machinery could be threaded with enough compliant wire to ensure that the risk remained manageable indefinitely. He thought about Sean Ashford noticing an anomaly in a weapons manifest and planning to file a report. He thought about 90 seconds. He thought about the Valley. He thought about 21 years of directing guilt at the wrong address, at himself, at the order he had followed, at the helicopter he had gotten onto when the correct address had been Hale the entire time, and Hale had been 30 years behind a rank insignia and a service record and the institutional protection of the people he had paid to ensure his protection. Dex opened his hand and looked at the memory card. Then he looked at Drummond. Wes. Drummond looked up. Show me everything. Drummond had 3 external monitors connected to his laptop, the screens tiled with data that had been accumulating since he first opened the files from Riley's card in the cave. He walked Dex through it in the methodical, dense manner of a briefing conducted by someone who has so thoroughly internalized the material that the presentation flows without effort. Financial records, operational timelines, the positions and responsibilities of the 11 officers whose names appeared in Riley's secondary file, the specific mechanisms by which each one had served the function of blocking the channels through which Hale's operation could have been exposed. He built it carefully, Drummond said, not all at once. Each piece placed only after the previous piece was stable. He started with the financial architecture, the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, the routing mechanisms that made the money difficult to follow without knowing where to look. Then he placed people. Not many. You don't need many if they're in the right positions. You need the person who processes the MCIS reports, the person who assigns investigation priorities at the IG's office, the people at DIA who decide which signals are worth actioning. He paused. Riley figured this out independently. She assembled the secondary file before the mission before she took the photographs. She knew she was documenting something that someone with authority would try to suppress. She was preparing a record that could survive even if she didn't. Boy Strand had come away from the trauma bay doors and was standing behind Drummond's shoulder reading the screens. She went into that mission knowing it was dangerous. She went into that mission having already done the work to ensure the evidence would matter if she came back and to ensure it would still matter if she didn't. Drummond looked at Dex. She's her father's daughter. The room absorbed this. Then Drummond said the thing that had been building beneath everything else, the thing that was the final piece of the architecture. I've been monitoring the communications channel since we inserted. 6 hours of intercepts. And there's something in the pattern of Hale's operational communications over the past 15 years that goes beyond the weapons trafficking. He brought up a timeline overlay dates operations outcomes. The ambushes. The ones where our people walked into positions that no external intelligence source should have been able to provide. The ones with the specific tactical precision that random intelligence failures don't produce. He looked at each of them. Hale was selling position data, movement schedules, the operational parameters of special operations units in theater. He paused. I can't give you a number for how many operations were compromised, but the pattern is consistent across 15 years in 3 major theaters. Taggart had come off the bench and was standing at the edge of the group looking at the screen. His jaw was set in the way it's set when something was being processed that was going to require physical response, and he was managing the timeline between the information and the action. He said nothing. The silence was eloquent. Dex thought about the names of men he had known, about operations that had gone wrong in ways that had been attributed to the fog of war, and the imperfect nature of intelligence, and the inherent unpredictability of combat in complex environments. The explanations had been accepted because what else does a person do with grief that has no specific address? They give it the most available explanation, and they carry it, and they continue. Some of those explanations had been wrong. Some of those men had died because of a transaction. Dex looked at the memory card on the desk beside Drummond's laptop. We've sent the files. 6 agencies, Drummond confirmed. MCIS, FBI, Counterterrorism, Defense Intelligence Agency, Congressional Oversight Inspector General, and the Washington Post. He paused. That was 9 hours ago. And silence. The word landed with its full weight. No acknowledgement, no movement, no indication that any of the 6 has actioned what we sent. He looked at Dex, which is consistent with what Riley's secondary file shows. Hale has people positioned in 3 of the 6 agencies I contacted. People whose function is exactly this: to receive reports, assess their priority, and determine whether they are actioned or filed without action. He's been blocking it, Strand said, for 15 years, systematically and effectively. Dex sat down. He sat with the full weight of 59 years in the past 8 hours in the understanding that the standard approach report, it trusts the system. Let the institutional machinery process it was not available. The machinery had been threaded with wire at its critical junctions, and the wire connected back to the man who had tried to kill Riley Ashford and who had killed Sean Ashford 21 years ago. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Calloway. The voice on the other end was composed professional, carrying the specific authority of someone accustomed to rooms in which they were the most consequential person present. This is Colonel Douglas Hale. I think we need to have a conversation. Dex said nothing. He looked at Drummond and held up 2 fingers the signal to record. Drummond's hands were already moving. You've had a productive night, Hale continued. I want to acknowledge that. The extraction was well executed. The girl's alive. I genuinely underestimated what your team was capable of at your respective ages. A pause. Not apologetic, the pause of a man establishing the register of what was about to be said. But let's discuss where this goes from here. I'm listening. You've sent files to 6 agencies. I'm aware of this. I'm also aware that as of this moment, those files are sitting in queues that will take weeks to process if they are processed at all. You've achieved nothing permanent. What you have done is create a situation in which I have a specific problem, and you and your team represent the most direct solution to that problem. Say what you want to say. I want to offer you a resolution that preserves what can be preserved. You walk away. Your team walks away. I will ensure that Lieutenant Ashford's death is redesignated as a training accident, full benefits to her family. No outstanding investigations, her service record intact. You and your team return to whatever version of retirement you've arranged, and this ends. Dex looked at the ceiling, at the fluorescent light of the hospital corridor, at the gap at the bottom of the trauma bay doors, beyond which Riley Ashford was being kept alive by people who were doing their jobs with complete dedication to an outcome that had nothing to do with the politics of what had put her there. And if I decline, then I have 6 hours before I can move assets into the position required to close this situation permanently. I have resources, Commander, more than you do and am better placed. I have people who can reach Lieutenant Ashford in that hospital. I have people who can ensure that your team doesn't leave Las Vegas. I have people in positions that make the institutional options you're considering unavailable. A pause. Walk away. Live. It's a better offer than you have any right to expect. One question, Dex said. Go ahead. Sean Ashford, tell me what happened. A silence on the line, longer than the other silences. Then Sean Ashford was going to file a report. He had identified anomalies in a weapons manifest that would have led directly to my operation. He was thorough, and he was smart, and he had already assembled enough to be dangerous. I had a week before his report reached someone positioned to act on it. So you killed him. I adjusted targeting data for an air support mission. The strike went to the coordinates I provided. Sean's team was at those coordinates. A pause. It wasn't personal, Calloway. It was operational. He was going to destroy something that had taken years to build. Dex held the phone against his ear and looked at the wall in front of him. He thought about 21 years, about the weight of the wrong story carried for the wrong reasons to the wrong address, about Riley at 6 years old with her father's eyes asking him if he had tried. You have 6 hours, Hale said. Use them wisely. The line went dead. Dex set the phone down on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man managing something that wanted to express itself physically and that was not under current circumstances permitted to do so. The room was quiet. Taggart said, We all heard that. Drummond recorded. Full audio timestamp duplicated to 3 backup locations. Strand was looking at Dex with the expression of a man waiting for the decision that everyone in the room already knew was coming. He's going to come for her regardless, Strand said. Walk away or not, he can't leave her alive after tonight. She's the witness, she's the evidence. While she's breathing, his exposure is total. I know. So we can't defend from here indefinitely. I know. Pruitt appeared in the corridor doorway, his left side bandaged beneath a hospital gown he had put over his clothes with the particular combination of medical compliance and tactical readiness that was native to his character. His color was better than it had been on the helicopter. His eyes were fully present. I heard the call, he said. You should be in bed. Tell me what we're doing. Dex looked at him, at all of them. At Drummond's screens, with their architecture of 15 years of institutional betrayal. At the trauma bay doors. At the memory card on the desk. He thought about what Hale was expecting them to do. Hale was expecting them to hold. To defend. To spend the 6 hours in the posture of people waiting for a system to respond that had been arranged not to respond. Hale was organizing, positioning, moving the resources that he had spent 15 years and $50 million assembling for exactly this kind of contingency. He was expecting them to be there when his resources arrived. He's expecting us to wait, Dex said. He's spent 6 hours counting on us defending this position. Every hour we hold here is an hour he uses to organize what he's going to bring against us. He looked at Drummond, the communications center at Nellis. You found a meeting scheduled there tonight. 2,200 hours, Drummond confirmed. Building 14 east side of the installation. He calls it Operation Clean Sweep. Based on the traffic I've been monitoring, it's a coordination session for the resources he's positioning against us. He'll be in that room on those systems with the people he's moving. He paused. The communications center has broadcast capability, active connections to JSOC, Pentagon operations, Fleet Command, Central Command, theater commanders across 3 regions. Everything said in that room during an active broadcast session goes to every command simultaneously. Dex looked at him. If Hale is in that room and says what he said to me on the phone on a live broadcast to those channels, there's no filing it, Drummond said. There's no burying it. There's no person positioned at any agency who can prevent every flag officer in the American military from having heard it simultaneously. It's already in the record before anyone can act on it. How do we get in? Maintenance tunnel from the Eastern Perimeter Water Treatment Facility. Runs directly to the building's infrastructure junction. It's monitored, but not heavily. I can override the sensors with the equipment I have. He paused. The override window is 60 seconds. We use it once, Strand. How many guards in the building? Based on the access logs, I've been pulling 4 outside, 2 inside as of the last rotation. Hale will have personal security with him, probably 2 additional contractors. He looked at the group. 8 total maximum, before Hale arrives, after potentially more. Taggart. What time is it now? 2014. Taggart picked up his rifle case. We have time. Dex looked at Pruitt. You stay. Pruitt held his gaze. She needs someone here who can protect her if Hale moves on the hospital before we finish this. She needs someone who knows what they're doing and who she can trust if she wakes up. Dex paused. That's you. It's not a lesser assignment. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Understood. Dex picked up his phone and scrolled to a number he had not dialed in over a year. It rang 3 times. Then a voice that sounded like it had been carved from the same material as the cave walls in which Riley had spent 3 days, dense, fundamental, undiminished by the hour. Who's this? Master Chief Ashford. This is Commander Dex Calloway. I served with your son, Sean. A pause, shorter than he expected. Calloway, I remember you from the funeral. You looked like a ghost. I felt like one, sir. You found her. It was not a question. It was the statement of a man who had understood from the moment the phone rang at this hour that the call meant the news was not the worst news, because the worst news does not come by phone from a man who served with your son. She's in surgery at Sunrise Hospital in Las Vegas. She's critical, but she's fighting. She's been alone in the desert for 3 days with serious injuries, and she's still fighting. Dex paused. I need you here, sir. The man who tried to kill her is going to try again, and I'm going to be somewhere else when he does. Riley needs protection. Pruitt will be here, but she needs you. A silence on the line, then address. Dex gave it. I'll be there in 4 hours. Where will you be? Finishing what Sean started. A longer pause. The sound of a man at 77 accessing something in himself that had not been called upon in some years, and finding it exactly where it had always been. Make them pay, Commander. Yes, sir. He ended the call, looked at his team, at Taggart loading the last magazine with the deliberate economy of a man who would not be taking anything extraneous into the next several hours. At Strand, checking his compact medical kit, smaller than the field version, configured for the specific contingencies of close-quarters operations. At Drummond, closing his laptop and stowing it in the tactical case, the sensor override protocols already loaded and ready. Old men, tired, some of them wounded, operating at the end of what the bodies they lived in were designed to sustain past the edge of what official sanction authorized in the specific territory that exists between what institutions permit and what situations require. This is treason on paper, Dex said. It was not the first time he had said it tonight, and he said it the same way he had said it each time, not to discourage, not to perform conscience, but to ensure that the men standing with him were making their choices with full information. Assaulting a military installation, detaining a superior officer, unauthorized broadcast on military channels. If this goes wrong, we spend what's left of our lives in Leavenworth. Taggart picked up his rifle case. Good thing we're not planning for it to go wrong. Strand, I didn't spend 30 years in this business to finish it standing still. Drummond closed his bag. The only version of tonight where anyone goes to Leavenworth is the version where Hale controls the narrative. We're going to take the narrative away from him. Dex looked at each of them. Then he looked at the trauma bay doors one final time. Behind those doors, Riley Ashford was fighting the last of the battle that had begun when she crawled out from under a burning wing panel 3 days ago. She had fought it without help, without backup, without the institutional support that was supposed to exist for people in her position, and that had been arranged to fail her. She had fought it on practice and will in her grandfather's voice and the stubborn refusal to be what someone had decided she was going to be. She had done her part. Now it was time to do his. "Let's go," Dex said. They went. The drive to Nellis took 22 minutes. They went in two vehicles, Taggart and Drummond in the lead, Dex and Strand, following the distance between the vehicles, maintained at the spacing that makes two vehicles look unrelated to a casual observer. The Las Vegas streets at this hour were occupied by the specific category of people and purposes that late-night urban landscapes produce, the city conducting its nocturnal version of itself with the energy that never fully leaves a place built on the premise that stopping was optional. Dex watched the city pass and thought about the broadcast. Hale had spent 15 years building an architecture of protection, financial, institutional, interpersonal. He had people in the right positions, money in the right accounts, relationships that served the function of ensuring that exposure was not possible through normal channels. He had constructed something that was for its intended purpose genuinely impressive. A system that used the mechanisms of oversight as the means of preventing oversight from functioning. A corruption that had learned to wear the face of the institution it was corrupting. The weakness in the architecture was the architecture itself. It was built to defeat institutional processes, the slow movement of reports through review structures, the assignment of investigative priority, the determination of which signals were worth following. It was not built to defeat a live broadcast to every major command simultaneously. There was no filing a live broadcast. There was no person positioned at any agency who could prevent flag officers from having already heard what they had heard before the intervention reached them. Hale had built a fortress against the expected attack. They were going in through a wall he had not thought to defend. They parked at the maintenance facility at the eastern perimeter of the installation. The building was dark and quiet, its functions sufficiently unglamorous to be uninteresting to anyone not specifically looking for it. Drummond went to the sensor panel at the maintenance hatch access with the small device he had built for exactly this category of problem, and the work he did at the panel took 90 seconds and produced the 60-second window he had promised. They went down through the hatch, into the tunnel. It was narrow and cold and smelled of the specific chemical combination that water treatment infrastructure produces, not unpleasant exactly, but specific enough to be memorable. Pipes ran along both walls carrying the various flows that a military installation of Nellis's size required to function, and the sounds they made formed a background conversation that was useful for the cover it provided to four men moving through confined space in tactical boots. Drummond led his forearm display showing the sensor positions and the timing windows between them. Each pause was precise, not estimated, not approximate, but calculated to the second based on the monitoring cycles he had mapped from the access logs. The team moved when he moved, and stopped when he stopped, and trusted the calculation, because the calculation was Drummond's, and Drummond's calculations in this domain had earned that trust over decades. At 100 meters he held them. Two voices ahead. Conversational. The specific cadence of people performing a routine task, they were not particularly engaged with the kind of conversation that occupies the foreground of attention without requiring it, a maintenance check running on whatever schedule the post-alert security protocols had added to the normal rotation. Drummond showed 4 fingers on his hand, pointed forward. Held up 2, then 2, again the positions of the 2 men relative to each other and to the team's approach. Dex looked at Strand. Strand looked at Dex. They moved forward in the specific way, not fast but precise, each footfall placed rather than landed the distance, covered in the time that the voices provided cover for it. The 2 maintenance workers were at a junction point, their attention on a panel. They were checking their orientation away from the approach. Strand went left. Dex went right. The pressure point and the chokehold were executed simultaneously and in silence, and both men were unconscious and horizontal before the panel they had been checking had registered their departure. Zip ties quickly applied, a side passage to tuck them into far enough from the main tunnel that discovery would take longer than the next hour required. They continued. The access ladder at the far end of the tunnel led up through a hatch into a maintenance closet adjacent to the communications center corridor. Taggart went first, the hatch opening silently on hinges that Drummond had confirmed were maintained rather than rusted. He cleared the closet in 4 seconds and signaled. The corridor was fluorescent-lit institutional, carrying the specific smell of electronics and cleaning products that military facilities share as a fundamental characteristic. Two guards at the far end, standing with the relaxed attention of a post that expected nothing unusual at this hour. Neither of them had been told that anything unusual was occurring because the information about what was unusual tonight had been managed at a level above their need to know. Dex and Taggart went left, Strand went right. The geometry of the approach took both guards out of each other's sight line for the necessary interval. The guards went down without firing a shot. They were placed in empty rooms off the main corridor, doors locked. No harm beyond the temporary loss of consciousness that certain pressure applications produce and from which recovery was complete and predictable. Two inside the communications center, Drummond said at minimum volume, based on the last access log update 3 minutes ago. The communications center was at the end of the corridor. Drummond worked the card reader with the device that had served them well at the hatch. 20 seconds this time the system was more sophisticated, but the principles were the same. The light changed from red to green. They entered. The room was large banks of monitors along 3 walls, communications equipment in configurations that reflected the center's function as the hub of the installation's external connections, the ambient hum of active technology, the low lighting of a room designed for sustained attention rather than casual occupancy. At the far end, a conference table with chairs arranged for a meeting that had not yet begun. 2 men in civilian tactical clothing looked up from a laptop as the door opened. They reached for weapons on the table. Don't. Dex's voice was not loud. It carried the specific quality of a statement that did not require volume because its authority was not derived from volume. Hands on the table. Don't speak. Don't move. You leave here tonight if you do those things. They complied. Strand had them zip-tied and moved to the corner within 30 seconds, the efficiency of a man who had done this specific operation many times and had refined it to its minimum necessary duration. Dex sat down in the chair at the head of the conference table. Drummond moved to the communications console, reviewing the interface with the familiarity of a man who had spent his career understanding how systems like this were designed. The architecture was exactly what the schematics had shown: multiple broadcast channels, simultaneous transmission capability to every command in the network, the logging infrastructure that captured and preserved everything transmitted on active channels. I can establish simultaneous active broadcast to JSOC, Pentagon Operations Fleet Command, Central Command, and Theater Commanders, Drummond said. The channels will log automatically as active the moment I open them. Everything said in this room from that point forward is in the record. Do it. Drummond's fingers moved across the console with the speed of someone executing a sequence they had rehearsed. The broadcast indicators came alive on the board, green lights, steady, each one representing a command or facility that was now receiving from this room. Dex looked at the green lights. He thought about what it meant that those lights were on. He thought about the flag officers in night duty operations centers across 3 time zones who were now receiving an active broadcast from a Nellis Communications Center at 2200 hours, who were paying attention to their boards in the specific way that unusual incoming signals at unusual hours produce attention. He thought about Hale walking through that door in 60 seconds. At 22:01 hours, the door opened. Colonel Douglas Hale entered, reading from a tablet, his attention on the document he was reviewing, his bearing carrying the complete ease of a man who was accustomed to walking into rooms and finding exactly what he expected to find. He was 55 years old with gray at the temples and a face that had appeared on award citations and command portraits, and the formal photographs that decorated the walls of buildings like this one composed authoritative, the accumulated presentation of 3 decades of institutional trust. He looked up from the tablet. Dex was sitting in his chair. Taggart's rifle was oriented in his direction. The 2 contractors who had been at the far end of the room were zip-tied in the corner, with Strand standing over them. Hale looked at all of this with the expression of a man updating a risk assessment in real time. Not panic, not fear. The specific, focused composure of a person who has encountered unexpected variables and is running the new calculation. Commander Calloway, he said. His voice was the voice of the phone call, composed and professional. You're early. Wanted to beat the rush. Hale looked at the communications console, at the broadcast indicators, at the green lights, each one steady and active. Something moved in his face, the first crack in the composed surface, a fractional adjustment that was not quite alarm and was more specific than surprise. You're broadcasting. Everything you say, Drummond confirmed. JSOC Pentagon Fleet Command Central Theater commands across 3 regions. Active logged already in the record. Hale looked at the console for a long moment. Then he looked at Dex with the expression of a man who has recognized that the geometry of his situation has changed and is deciding how to operate within the new geometry. I'm not saying anything. You told me on the phone that you adjusted targeting data for an air support mission in Afghanistan in 2004, Dex said. That Sean Ashford's team was at the coordinates you provided, that it was operational rather than personal. He paused. Say it again. Here, on the record. Hale was quiet. You told me you sell weapons, Dex continued, that you sell position data, that the money funds operations that Congress won't approve. Say it again. You're asking me to confess to treason in front of every flag officer in the American military. I'm asking you to say what you said to me on the phone, on the record, to the people who have the authority to act on it. Dex's voice was level. The files are already out. The financial records, the operational timelines, the names of the 11 officers on Riley's list, it's all been sent. What you say here either confirms the record or contradicts it. Either way, the record exists. A silence. Then Hale walked to the conference table and sat down in a chair 3 positions from where Dex was sitting, and the gesture was strange. The gesture of a man choosing to engage rather than resist the gesture of someone who had made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion that the people in the room had not expected. You want to understand it, Hale said. You think if I explain it, you'll understand something about how someone does this. I want it on the record. The money, Hale said, and his voice had changed register, not confessional, but analytical. The voice of someone examining their own work, the way an engineer examines a completed structure. The money started small, a commission on a transaction that no one was going to miss because the equipment was being decommissioned anyway. And then the next one, and the next. And at some point, the architecture of what I'd built was more important to protect than any single transaction, and the protection required additional transactions, and the people who could have exposed it required management. He paused. The weapons went to places where they were used. I don't pretend otherwise. The information went to people who used it. I know what happened to the operations it was used against. He looked at Dex. I made those calculations and I made them clearly. I'm not going to tell you I didn't understand what I was doing. Sean Ashford, Dex said. Sean Ashford was going to file a report, Hale said. Yeah. His voice did not change. He had found the anomalies in the manifest. He was thorough and he was careful and he was going to take it up the chain in a way that would have reached someone outside my network. I adjusted the targeting data for a close air support mission he was coordinating. The strike went where I sent it. He paused. He was at those coordinates. In the room, no one moved. The broadcast indicators were green and steady. Every word was in the record. Traveling at the speed of the communications network to operations centers on 3 continents, where duty officers were listening and logging and reaching for phones to call people higher in the chain than themselves. Because what was coming through the broadcast channel at 22:13 hours from Manila's communications center was something that required the immediate attention of people with the authority to act on it. Taggart moved. He had been at the door since Hale sat down his rifle in his hands, his face holding the expression it held when something was being processed that was going to require a response, and the response was being held until the appropriate moment. When Hale said the words about the targeting data, Taggart set the Mark 13 aside and walked to the conference table and stood over Hale and looked at him. Then he shot him in the left thigh with his SIG. The sound in the enclosed room was significant. Hale went sideways off the chair. The controlled, composed architecture of his presentation came apart in the way that physical pain dismantles architecture completely and immediately. He was on the floor, his hand on his leg, his face expressing what had been beneath the composure for the entire duration of the conversation. Taggart stood over him. His voice was very quiet. That was for Sean, he said, and for every man who walked into a position you sold. Dex was beside Hale, his hand on the man's collar, ensuring he remained present and oriented and accountable to the room and to the broadcast that was still running and to the people who were listening to it. Is there anything you want to add, Dex said, to the record before we close the broadcast? Hale looked up at him from the floor. The calculation was still running behind his eyes. It apparently never stopped the arithmetic of his situation, the constant assessment of variables and outcomes. You've destroyed 30 years, he said. You destroyed 30 years, Dex said. We just made sure everyone knew it. He looked at Drummond. Drummond nodded once. The broadcast had what it needed. He reached for the console. Leave it open, Dex said, until someone on the other end closes it. Then they moved. Getting out was harder than getting in because the base was now in an alert state, the security systems responding to whatever the guards in the corridor had managed to report before they were taken out of the equation. The installation shifting into the condition that security alerts produce more people moving through corridors, more attention being paid to the things that an alert directs attention toward. Hale moved with assistance, Taggart's hand under his right arm, the wounded leg bearing weight badly but bearing it. Strand had applied a compression wrap at the conference table in the 45 seconds available to him, sufficient to control the bleeding for the duration of movement. Hale said nothing. He moved because moving toward whatever came next was preferable to remaining in Building 14 when the base security teams arrived, and he was still running the calculation. Through the corridor, the empty rooms where the guards were secured, down the ladder, through the tunnel. At the far end of the tunnel, two soldiers, young alert, responding to the alert with the earnest urgency of people who did not yet know what they were responding to. They were blocking the route to the hatch. Dex made the assessment in the time it took to make it. These were not contractors. These were not Hale's people. These were American soldiers doing their jobs in response to an alert on their installation, and harming them was not available regardless of what it would cost in terms of the extraction's efficiency. He walked toward them with the bearing of a man who belonged in the corridor and had business to conduct in it, in the specific quality of that bearing, to the walk of someone for whom this environment was native, rather than infiltrated, produced 2 seconds of hesitation in the soldiers that was not quite enough to stop what happened next, but was enough to ensure that what happened next was not what it would have been without those 2 seconds. Strand went left. Taggart handled Hale in the right. Dex went through the middle. 4 seconds. The soldiers were on the floor restrained, uninjured, and the team was at the hatch. Through it, across the perimeter. The fence cut on the inbound, the gap still present. Into the vehicles. They drove. Drummond was on his phone before the vehicle was moving. The intercepts he had been monitoring for hours were showing the downstream effect of the broadcast in real-time traffic from JSOC, from Pentagon operations, from Fleet Command, queries and confirmations, and the specific urgency of communications networks that have received something that requires immediate senior attention and are activating the people who provide that attention. It's moving, Drummond said. JSOC has issued an internal alert. Pentagon operations is active. There's a helicopter from Nellis with a new tasking. He scrolled. The FBI field office in Las Vegas is being activated. He looked at Dex. The dam broke. Dex looked out the window at the Las Vegas skyline approaching as they drove toward the city. The same city that had been blazing on the horizon when they flew into it on the helicopter, indifferent then and indifferent now to the events occurring at its margin. He thought about Sean, about Riley, about the 3 tridents that would in some months rest at the base of a headstone in Arlington. His phone rang. Unknown number. Calloway. Commander Calloway. The voice was female, professional, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to calls at unusual hours and trained to be fully present in them from the first word. This is General Sandra Briggs, JSOC Command. I've been monitoring your broadcast from the past 22 minutes. Dex said nothing. He waited. I want you to know, Briggs continued, that I have had an ongoing investigation into Colonel Hale's operations for the past 9 months. I have been blocked at every attempt to advance it, reports of brought-in and not actioned, resources allocated and then reallocated, personnel assigned to the investigation and then reassigned. I have been building what I could within those constraints. A pause. Tonight provided what I could not produce through any available official channel. A live logged multi-command broadcast of a sworn officer confessing to the specific acts in question. That broadcast is now in the permanent record of 6 commands simultaneously. There is no mechanism available to Hale or anyone connected to him to remove it. General, you're bringing him to Sunrise Hospital. Yes, ma'am. I'll be there in 40 minutes with an FBI team and a representative from the Inspector General's office. Colonel Hale will be taken into official custody. She paused. As for you and your team, what happened tonight at Nellis is going to require careful handling. There are legal dimensions that are genuinely complex. Another pause, and when she spoke again, something had changed in her register, something below the professional, something more direct. What you accomplished tonight matters in ways that are going to take months to fully understand. The evidence Riley Ashford assembled, the broadcast you produced, the arrests that will follow, we're talking about the largest corruption prosecution in the military's recent history. Oh, pause. I'll see you in 40 minutes, Commander. The line ended. Drummond was looking at him. Briggs, she's been running a parallel investigation for 9 months, blocked the entire time. Dex looked at the road. She needed the thing that couldn't be blocked. We gave it to her. Riley gave it to her. 3 days ago in the breast pocket of her flight suit before she ever got on that helicopter. They pulled into the Sunrise Hospital parking structure at 0031. Frank Ashford was at the entrance, 77 years old, standing with the straight back that decades of service had made structural rather than effortful, wearing civilian clothing that somehow still read as a uniform to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The bag at his feet was heavier than civilian travel required. His eyes went to the vehicle, to Dex, to Hale in the rear seat, to Strand and Taggart and Drummond, and his face conducted its assessment in approximately 2 seconds, recognition, inventory, conclusion. He met Dex at the vehicle door. "You got him, ma'am," Frank said, "and we got him." Frank looked at Hale. The look lasted less than 3 seconds. It was not an emotional look. It was the specific look of a man who has carried something for a long time and has just been shown the thing that the something was attached to, and who is conducting the final accounting. He said nothing to Hale. He did not need to. He looked at Dex. "Is it finished?" "The broadcast is in the record. General Briggs is inbound with FBI. It's finished." Dex paused. "Sean can rest." Something moved across Frank Ashford's face that was very brief and very complete. He nodded once, the nod of a man receiving information that he had been waiting for long enough, that waiting had become indistinguishable from the structure of his daily life, and that now the information had arrived and the structure had changed. "Come," he said. "She's asking for you." Dex stopped. "She's awake. She came out of surgery 40 minutes ago. She's been asking for you since she could form sentences." He looked at Dex with the directness that was native to him, the look that had looked at Dex across the body of his son 21 years ago, and that had not changed in its fundamental quality in the intervening time. "She's her father's daughter, Dex. She doesn't do anything slowly when she has something to do." They brought Hale inside. Strand treated his leg with the professional thoroughness that the situation required, regardless of his personal relationship to the patient, and within 20 minutes, General Briggs arrived with the FBI team, and the institutional machinery of accountability began to operate at full capacity. Hale was taken into official custody with the formal precision of people who understood that everything that followed depended on the process being conducted correctly and who were conducting it correctly. Briggs spoke with Dex in the corridor. Brief, direct, her assessment of the situation delivered without the softening that lesser people apply to complicated facts. "Officially," she said, "the events at Building 14 tonight did not occur in a manner that creates prosecutable exposure for you or your team. The broadcast was received and logged by 6 commands before the session was terminated. That log constitutes the official record and supersedes the circumstances of how the session was initiated." She looked at him steadily. "Officially and unofficially. Unofficially, you did what 9 months of authorized investigation could not do. You put Hale's confession in the permanent record of the American military. You produced the evidence that will result in 12 arrests within 72 hours, the dismantling of a weapons trafficking network that has been operating for 15 years, and the prosecution of 11 officers who sold their positions and the people those positions were supposed to protect." She extended her hand. "The Navy owes you a debt, Commander. All of you." He shook her hand. She went back to her work because there was a great deal of it, and she was the kind of person who did it rather than delegated it. Dex walked to Riley's floor and found the room and pushed the door open. She was awake, pale, marked by everything she had been through, connected to the equipment that was managing the last of the sepsis and the structural damage of 3 days in the desert, but awake fully. Clearly awake, with her father's eyes open and direct, and finding him immediately as he came through the door. "Uncle Dex." He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her bed. The chair that had been placed there by someone who understood that there would be a person sitting in it. "Riley, you came for me. I promised your father." She was quiet for a moment. The monitors measured her steadily. Outside the window, the Las Vegas night was doing what it always did, blazing indifferent, conducting its particular version of the human project of remaining in motion at all hours. "I kept telling myself you'd come," she said. Her voice was still damaged from the smoke and the dehydration worn to its fundamental frequency. "In the cave, when the fever was bad, I kept saying it. Someone will come. Uncle Dex will come." She paused. "Mom always said you were a story she'd made up, that you weren't real." "I wasn't real for a long time," Dex said. "I'm sorry for that." She looked at him with the directness that was Sean Ashford's directness and Frank Ashford's directness, the look that ran unmodified through 3 generations of people who had decided at some foundational level that seeing things clearly was worth the cost. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." Frank appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment looking at his granddaughter in the hospital bed and at Dex sitting beside her, and his face did the thing that it very rarely did. It showed briefly and completely what was underneath the composure that had been the surface he presented to the world for as long as anyone who knew him could remember. He walked to the other side of the bed. He put his large scarred hand on Riley's forehead in the gesture of someone taking a temperature, and also the gesture of someone who loves the person whose temperature they are taking, and he said nothing for a moment. "Hey there, little warrior," he said finally. His voice was steady. Everything about Frank Ashford was steady, and the steadiness now was costing him something that was visible only in the slight deliberateness of his breathing. "You had quite an adventure." "Papa." Riley's hand found his. They stayed like that. Then Frank looked up at Dex across the bed. "Sean would be proud of her," he said. "Sean would be overwhelmed by her," Dex said. "She's done more than he ever got the chance to do." Riley's eyes were filling. She was not apparently going to prevent this. "He died because of hail," she said. "The targeting data. I read the original incident report 3 years ago, and something never added up. I started looking into it when I got to Nellis." She paused. "That is why I had the secondary file ready before the mission. I already knew what I was going to find. I just needed the photographs to make the case complete." Dex looked at her. "You've been building this case for 3 years." "Since I read the incident report." She held his gaze. "I couldn't prove it without the photographs. And I couldn't photograph it without the mission. And when the mission came up, I made sure I was assigned to it." A pause. "I knew there was risk. I prepared for the risk. You prepared for the possibility that you wouldn't come back." "The secondary file." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Dad died trying to report it. I wasn't going to let what happened to him happen again without doing everything I could to prevent it." The room was quiet. The monitors measured. Frank held his granddaughter's hand. Dex thought about 21 years, about the weight that had been wrong in its address for the entire duration of its being carried, about what it felt like to set it down. "He would be so proud of you," Dex said, "beyond anything I can tell you." "I know," Riley said, and for the first time since he had come through the door, she smiled. "Because of you, Uncle Dex. Because you kept your promise. You gave me back the rest of the story." Outside the room in the corridor, General Briggs was conducting the first of what would be many hours of official proceedings. Hale was in a room at the end of the hall. His leg treated the legal machinery of his accountability in full operation around him. Taggart was sitting in the corridor with his back against the wall and his eyes closed, not sleeping, but resting in the way of people who have learned to find recovery in the intervals between requirements. Strand was somewhere in the hospital talking to a nurse who had noticed the quality of the field medicine applied to Riley's burns and wanted to understand how it had been done with what was available. Drummond was in a corner with his laptop watching the downstream effects of the broadcast ripple through the communications infrastructure of the American military in real time. And Pruitt came through the door. His left side bandaged his gait, showing only a trace of what the wound had cost him. And he looked at Riley in the bed and at Dex and Frank on either side of her, and he said nothing for a moment. "Then we got him." "We got him," Riley confirmed. Pruitt sat down in a chair against the wall and looked at his hands, the hands that had trained Sean Ashford, the hands that had fired the claymore in the desert and managed the right flank one-handed and absorbed the abdominal wound without breaking pace, the hands that were here because a debt that had been accumulating for 21 years had finally found its payment. "He trained your father," Dex said to Riley. "Gray trained Sean." Riley looked at Pruitt. "I know," she said. "Papa told me." She paused. "He said you were the best instructor Sean ever had, that you made him what he was." Pruitt looked at her. Something moved in his face that was not easily categorized. "Your father made himself what he was," he said. "I just made sure the door was open." The night moved toward morning in the way that nights move when the things that needed to happen in them have happened not quickly, but with the sense of a direction that is no longer in question. Outside the window, Las Vegas continued its indifferent brilliance. Inside, a woman who had refused to die for 3 days in the Nevada desert lay in a hospital bed and held her grandfather's hand and looked at the people in the room with her father's eyes, and the room contained among its various furniture and equipment and people something that was not grief and was not quite joy and was possibly the particular quality of peace that arrives when a story has found its right ending. 4 months later, Arlington National Cemetery held the cold of November in the way it held everything permanently without opinion, in the patient silence of a place whose purpose is the accommodation of things that must be held somewhere. They came separately and arrived together. Taggart first, Strand beside him, Drummond with his laptop bag present by habit not opened. Pruitt with the trace of the wound in his walk, managing it toward invisibility with the patient discipline of a man who does not permit limitations to define him. Frank with his cane, the cane being new, a concession to a knee that had spent 77 years being managed rather than addressed and had finally insisted on the addressing. Riley in her uniform. 4 months of recovery had restored the physical function, the weight that the desert had taken from her, returned the burns on her forearm, healed the scars that would remain, and that she had no particular relationship of shame with because they were the record of something she had done rather than something done to her. She stood with the straight back that was hers before the Navy gave it additional reasons to be straight. And Dex. He stood in front of the stone and read the name he had been reading in his mind for 21 years. The rank, the unit, the dates that contained a life. The words at the bottom that were the words available when the full truth of a person exceeded what marble could hold. He reached into his jacket. The trident was the one he had earned 36 years ago and worn through everything that came after. It had been on the chest of every dress uniform for 36 years. It was the physical representation of everything he had given, and everything it had cost, and everything it had made him. He had been carrying it in his jacket pocket for 4 months, since the morning after Riley came out of surgery, and he had understood what the next chapter of this story required. He crouched at the base of the headstone. The grass was cold and wet against his knee. "I kept my promise, Sean." His voice was quiet in the way of things said to the dead, not whispered but contained, intended for a specific listener rather than a general audience. "She's safe, she's whole. She's stronger than either of us were at her age, which I didn't think was possible." He paused. "Hale is in a federal facility. The network he built is being dismantled. The men who took money to protect him are being prosecuted. The record is right." Another pause. "I'm sorry I was 21 years late with this. I'm not going to spend what's left trying to make that right because there's no formula for making 21 years right, but I'm here, and I understand now why I'm here, and that's going to have to be enough." He placed the trident at the base of the stone. He stayed crouching for a moment. Then he stood. Riley moved forward. She reached into the breast pocket of her uniform and brought out her trident, the one the teams had presented in a private ceremony 3 weeks after she left the hospital, attended by Dex and Frank and her mother, and the senior enlisted personnel of the community who understood what she had done and chose to express it in the oldest language available to them. She placed it beside Dex's. The two tridents rested against the base of the stone side by side. Frank opened the small velvet box. Inside the trident was older than the others, the gold worn at its edges. The finish of it softened by years of being handled by the man who had earned it, and then by the woman who had kept it after he was gone. Catherine Ashford had called Frank 2 months after the hospital. She had said that Sean would want it here, that it was time for it to be here. Frank's hands did not shake. He crouched at the base of the headstone, slowly the knee requiring management that Kane set aside, and he placed Sean Ashford's trident between the other two. 3 tridents. The November light, thin and gray, found the gold and held it in the way that thin light holds things gently, without insistence, allowing the object to exist in its own quality rather than the light's. 3 generations, Frank said. His voice was what it always was, the voice of a man who had decided at some point in the past that the way he met the world was going to be steadiness, and who had maintained that decision through everything the world had sent to test it. One family. Dex wept. He had not wept since 2004. He had not wept at the funeral because, at the funeral, he had still been carrying the wrong story. The story in which he had failed by following orders, which produce guilt and recrimination rather than grief. And those are different things, and they live in different parts of the body, and only one of them releases when the story is finally right. The story was right now. The record was right. Sean had not died because Dex had failed him. He had died because Hale had decided he was expendable and had used the mechanisms of the institutional system to produce that outcome with the precision of a man who understood those mechanisms completely. Dex had been an instrument of what had happened without knowing he was an instrument of it, and the 21 years of guilt he had directed at himself had been 21 years spent in the wrong room. He wept for Sean, for the years Sean had not had, for the daughter who had grown up without him, for the father that Frank had lost, for the men who had walked into positions that Hale had sold and had not walked back out. He wept for 21 years of carrying the wrong weight to the wrong address. Riley's arm went around his shoulders. She said nothing. She held on. Behind them, Taggart stood with his hands at his sides and his face turned slightly away, giving the moment the space it required. Strand looked at the three tridents with the expression of a man who has carried the grief of a specific loss for a long time and is watching that grief find its correct resting place. Drummond looked at the headstone with the look of someone reading the final line of something they have been trying to understand for 21 years. Pruitt stood in the particular stillness that was native to him, and the quality of his stillness was different from its usual quality, less watchful, more settled, the stillness of a man who has paid a debt and can now stand in a different relationship to the weight he has been carrying. After a while, Dex straightened. He looked at the three tridents at the base of the stone. He looked at the name on the stone. He looked at Riley. Your grandfather told me once that Sean was the best man he'd ever trained, Dex said. I've been thinking about that for 21 years and whether it was true. He paused. I think the best thing Sean ever did was you. Riley looked at him with her father's eyes and her mother's composure, and the specific quality that was entirely her own, the quality of a person who has looked at the worst the world produces and has chosen clearly and completely not to be reduced by it. I'm going to prove you right about that, she said. They walked away from the grave together, the seven of them, into the November morning that was cold and gray and completely indifferent to whether the things that had needed to happen had happened. The morning did not know. The morning did not care. It was doing what mornings do, existing, persisting, providing the hours that people fill with whatever they find worthy of the filling. They walked out of Arlington and into whatever came next. 6 months after Arlington, Dex Calloway sat on the beach at Virginia Beach and watched the Atlantic conduct its perpetual conversation with the shore. He was retired. Actually, genuinely finally retired. The kind of retirement that was real rather than theoretical, that had a present tense quality rather than a future tense quality, that did not contain the suspended readiness of a person who believed they might be called back into service at any moment. He had been called back for the last time. The last mission was complete. The promise was kept. His apartment was quieter than it had been for 36 years. He had given away most of his operational equipment, not the SIG which remained on the table where he cleaned it on Tuesday evenings, but the gear that belonged to a version of his life that was finished. He kept the photograph of himself and Sean, now kept in a frame rather than a pocket on the shelf above the kitchen table where he could see it from the chair where he sat to read. He kept the letters from Riley, which she wrote on paper because she was her grandfather's granddaughter and understood the permanence that physical form provides to things that deserve to be permanent. The sun was moving toward the horizon in the way it moved on November evenings on the Virginia coast, with the specific quality of light that exists in that hour between afternoon and dark, the amber and rose and gold that the clouds caught and held before releasing it to the water where it spread and dissolved and became part of the general motion of the sea. His phone lay on the sand beside him. It buzzed, a message from Riley Hellweek complete. 47 started, 19 finished. I was one of them. Papa won't stop crying. He keeps insisting he has allergies. Please don't tell him I told you, he cried. Dex sat with this for a moment. He looked at the ocean. He thought about Sean Ashford at 26 completing the same program on a different coast in a different decade, in the beginning of the story that had taken 21 years and several lives and one extraordinary young woman to reach its right ending. He typed, "Your father would be proud beyond anything I can put into words." Her response came before the next wave reached the shore. I know. Because of you, Uncle Dex, you kept your promise. You came when it mattered. You gave me back his legacy, and you gave me the truth about how he died, and you let me finish what he started. That's everything. That's all of it. He started to type something and stopped. He set the phone down on the sand and looked at the horizon where the water and the sky were conducting the evening negotiation about where one ended and the other began. The phone buzzed again. Drummond final count from the federal prosecution, 14 arrests connected to Hale's network. $127 million in seized assets. Congressional hearings scheduled for January. The Washington Post is calling it the largest military corruption prosecution in 50 years. We did it, boss. And then from Taggart, whose messages were always brief because Taggart believed in using only the number of words the situation strictly required, Riley made it through Hell Week. Thought you should know, I watched the finish from the beach in Coronado. Didn't tell her. Drove 14 hours. Worth it. Dex read this and felt something that required no analysis and no categorization. It simply was what it was, which was the particular feeling that arrives when the people who have been through hard things together find afterward that they are still who they were to each other, and perhaps more so. He set the phone down again. The sun reached the horizon. The light changed in the way that light changes at that moment, not gradually, but in a series of discrete shifts, each one moving the color and the quality of everything visible through a transition that could not be predicted from the previous state. The sky becoming something different with each passing minute, until the different thing was fully what it was going to be. Dex Calloway sat on the sand in the fading light, and he was for the first time in 21 years genuinely and completely at peace. Not the absence of pain he had learned across the years. That peace did not require the absence of pain. Not the absence of memory. Memory was not the enemy of peace. Only the wrong relationship to memory was the enemy of peace. And he had finally, at 59, found the right relationship to the memories he carried. Not the absence of loss. The loss was real and permanent, and he was not diminished by acknowledging it. Just peace. The actual condition. The state of a man who has done what he was here to do and has done it honestly and can sit on a beach in November and watch the ocean and require nothing further from the hour than what the hour already contains. Somewhere in Coronado, Riley Ashford had just completed the thing that her father had completed 30 years before her on a different beach in the beginning of a story that had taken 30 years and one extraordinary act of survival and a group of old men who remembered what a promise meant to reach this particular ending. The waves came in, the waves went out. Dex breathed. The story was complete.